I never liked driving in the dark, but by the time I reached the gravel road that led to the cabin, the sun was already gone. The headlights carved two narrow tunnels through the trees, and every turn of the wheel felt like I was slipping deeper into nowhere. The place wasn't far from the town of North Hollow, maybe a 40-minute drive, but once I left the main road, the silence swallowed everything. I could hear only the crackle of gravel under my tires, the occasional thud of a rock, and the faint rattle of something loose in the trunk. I had rented the cabin online 2 weeks earlier. The listing had promised a quiet, rustic retreat on Red Maple Lake, perfect for writing or just disconnecting. That was exactly what I thought I needed. I was 33, living alone in a small apartment in Pittsburgh, and my life had started to feel like the same day on repeat. I worked from home, staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned, and when I closed my laptop, I usually just opened another screen. Phone, TV, whatever filled the silence. I told myself the trip would be good for me. Just me, a lake, and a few days without emails or traffic. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow lane with no streetlights. When I pulled up, the headlights hit the front of the structure, and for a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake. The place was older than the pictures showed. The wood siding was weathered to a grayish color, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. Still, it stood there solid, with a small porch and two windows looking out at the drive. Behind it, the black shape of the lake spread out wide, the surface catching faint reflections of moonlight through the trees. I killed the engine, and the silence hit like a weight. I could hear the wind pushing through branches, the faint rush of water lapping the shore. No cars, no voices, no electricity humming, just that wide emptiness. I sat for a moment longer before stepping out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The key was where the owner had said it would be, in a small lockbox on the porch rail. My fingers shook a little in the cold as I opened it. The cabin door groaned when I pushed it in, and the smell hit me immediately. A mix of damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old nails. Inside, the cabin was bare bones. One main room with a couch, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen tucked to the side. A short hallway led to a bedroom and bathroom. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the only light came from a single lamp by the couch, which flickered slightly when I turned it on. I dropped my duffel bag on the couch and stood there for a while, listening. It was strange to notice how much noise silence could carry. The house clicked as it settled. The wind rattled a loose shutter outside. Somewhere in the walls, I could hear the faint scratch of what might have been mice. I told myself I'd get used to it. That first night, I unpacked just enough to make the bed and put some food in the fridge. I heated a can of soup, ate at the small wooden table, and tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. They were just black squares looking out at the woods, nothing but my own reflection staring back. I finally went to bed around 11. The sheets were cold, the mattress stiff. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of the lake moving outside, gentle, steady, like breathing. The next morning, the world looked different. Sunlight poured through the trees, lighting the water like glass. The lake stretched wide and still, with a thin mist clinging to the far shore. I made coffee, took a chair onto the porch, and sat there breathing in the cold, clean air. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I spent most of the day exploring. The path behind the cabin wound down to the lake, where an old wooden dock stretched a few feet into the water. The boards were warped, some cracked, but it held my weight. I stood there for a long time, watching the water ripple around the edges. Later, I walked into the woods. The leaves were just starting to turn, flashes of red and orange against the green. The ground was soft with pine needles. Every now and then, I saw signs of animals, tracks, droppings, a feather caught on a branch, but no people. No voices. The deeper I went, the stronger that feeling of distance grew, as if I were slipping out of the world I knew. That night, I cooked pasta on the small stove, poured a glass of wine, and wrote in a notebook for the first time in years. I didn't write anything important, just scraps of thought, lines about the woods, about the stillness of the water, but it felt good to put something on paper. When I went to bed, the silence seemed less sharp, more like a blanket. I slept deeper. The change came on the third night. I had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when something woke me. At first, I couldn't tell what. The cabin was quiet, the kind of heavy quiet that made your ears strain for any sound. I lay there staring into the dark, heart beating faster than it should. Then I heard it, a crunch. Gravel. Slow, deliberate, somewhere near the drive. I froze. My first thought was that it was nothing, maybe an animal, maybe just the house shifting. But then it came again. A step. Then another. The sound of weight on gravel, moving closer. I sat up in bed, every nerve awake. My mind scrambled through possibilities. Maybe the owner came by, maybe a neighbor. But the owner lived 2 hours away, and I hadn't seen a single other cabin on the lake. The steps stopped. I sat there in the dark for what felt like forever, barely breathing, waiting. Then came a new sound, the faintest brush against the porch boards, like something dragging lightly over wood. I got out of bed, careful not to let the floor creak, and reached for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand. I didn't turn it on yet. Moving to the window, I pulled the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just trees and the faint outline of the drive in moonlight. I stayed there watching until my eyes burned. Nothing moved. No more sounds came. Finally, I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer, a raccoon, anything else. I crawled back into bed, though it took hours before sleep finally came. In the morning, I checked the drive. The gravel showed marks, indentations, but I couldn't be sure if they were new. I crouched, ran my hand over them, tried to decide if they were from boots or just the unevenness of the ground. The more I stared, the less certain I felt. The day passed slowly after that. Couldn't relax. Every time I went inside, I caught myself glancing at the windows. Every time I heard a branch snap in the woods, I froze. By evening, I had convinced myself I was just on edge, reading too much into normal sounds. But when night came again, I couldn't shake the tension. I double-checked the locks, closed every curtain, kept the flashlight by my bed. I told myself I was being careful, not paranoid. Still, I barely slept. The next few days blurred together. I kept thinking I heard things at night. Footsteps, movement outside, faint taps against the walls. I never saw anything when I checked, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The air itself felt charged, like being watched. During the day, I tried to distract myself. I wrote, I walked the woods, I fished from the dock, but I kept catching signs I couldn't explain. Once, I found a cigarette but in the dirt near the tree line. Old, maybe, but damp, as if it hadn't been there long. Another time, I thought I saw a shape move between the trees, a dark flash of a figure, but when I stared, it was gone. I told myself again and again that I was imagining it, but my body didn't believe it. My hands shook when I lit the stove. My chest stayed tight. On the 6th night, I heard the steps again. Clear this time. Gravel, slow, coming up the drive. Then silence. Then the sound of the porch boards creaking. I sat in the dark with the flashlight clutched in my hand, sweat cold on my skin. I thought about shouting, about making it clear someone was inside, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I sat frozen, waiting. Then came the sound that broke me. A soft, deliberate scrape along the outside wall, just below the bedroom window. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was deeper in the woods than I expected, tucked far past the gravel road that had already chewed up my car tires and rattled every bolt loose. The listing online had made it look charming, simple, quiet. I wanted quiet. I wanted something far away from the constant pull of the city, the endless traffic, the voices, the schedules. What I got was more than quiet. I got something that at times felt like silence itself had a weight, pressing down on me, closing me in. It was the fall of 1998, late October. I was 26 years old and burned out from work I didn't even like. I'd saved just enough to rent the cabin for a month, thinking maybe the air, the trees, the distance would do something for me that nothing else had. The road twisted on for miles, narrowing to the point where I wondered if I had missed a turn. But then the trees broke just enough to show the roofline through bare branches. Dark wood siding, A small porch with one step sagging in the middle, a metal chimney pipe crooked like a bent finger. When I pulled up, I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of a plane overhead. Just wind brushing through the trees and the faint creak of the cabin boards shifting in the cool air. Inside, it smelled of dry wood and dust, the kind of smell that sticks to old rugs and couches that haven't been moved in years. There was one main room with a wood stove, a kitchenette tucked against the far wall, a bedroom off to the left, and a bathroom that barely fit its sink and shower. The furniture looked like it had been dragged out of someone's basement. A sagging couch, a coffee table with water rings, a single wooden chair with a split down the back. I unpacked slowly, as if rushing might disturb something in the air. I set my bag on the bed, spread out some of the food I'd brought, cans, pasta, bread, a small jar of peanut butter, and checked the cupboards, which were mostly empty except for a chipped mug and a frying pan with the handle taped up. That night, I built my first fire in the stove. I had never done it before, so it took me longer than it should have. My matches snapped, the paper burned too quickly, the wood smoked. When it finally caught and the orange glow filled the room, I felt a kind of relief, the kind that loosens your shoulders and makes you believe you figured something out. But the woods didn't let me settle completely. Long after I lay down, I heard them. Not voices, not animals I could name, but shifting. Weight moving through leaves, branches bending under pressure. At first, I told myself it was deer. It had to be deer. I wanted to believe it was just the natural world doing what it does. But I couldn't shake the sense that some of the noises weren't random. They had pauses, patterns, like someone was moving and then stopping to listen. I slept poorly, waking up to every sound. By morning, I was stiff and groggy, but I convinced myself it was just nerves. City mind in country quiet. That was all. I spent the day exploring. The cabin sat at the end of a small clearing, with trees crowding close on every side. Behind it, the land sloped upward into thicker woods. I followed a narrow trail that twisted between oaks and pines, damp earth sucking at my boots. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, though the sun was still bright. I walked until I reached a stream, its water clear and fast, then doubled back. Halfway back to the cabin, I saw something that made me stop. It was a tree wide and tall with fresh marks on its bark. Not scratches, not animal claw marks. These were straight lines, cut with something sharp. An axe, maybe, or a heavy knife. They ran in a pattern that wasn't random. Parallel slashes stacked over each other. The wood beneath was pale, still wet, which meant they were fresh. I told myself it was someone marking trees for firewood. Maybe a hunter, maybe just kids messing around. I stood there staring too long before shaking it off and heading back. The rest of the day was uneventful. I cooked pasta on the stovetop, read half of a book I brought, and chopped some firewood from the small stack already there. I tried not to think about the tree. I tried not to think about how far I was from anyone else. But that night, the noises came again. Louder this time, leaves crunching in steady steps, something brushing against the porch, the handle of the door rattling once, then going still. I lay in bed frozen, eyes fixed on the shadowed ceiling. The fire had burned low, leaving the cabin darker than before, every corner heavy with shapes that might have been furniture or might have been something else. I stayed that way until exhaustion finally dragged me down. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing was moved, nothing was taken, but the dirt at the base of the steps was disturbed. Not paw prints, not hooves, shoes. I crouched down, staring at them. They weren't sharp enough to make out size or tread, but the shape was there. Human. The air felt colder even though the sun was out. My skin prickled. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe they were my own from unloading the car. Maybe I'd stepped there and forgotten. But deep down I knew I hadn't. The prints were angled toward the door, not away. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the table staring at it. I didn't have a phone signal out here. I didn't have a neighbor nearby to ask. I didn't even know how far the nearest house was. For the first time, I wondered if coming here alone had been a mistake. That night, I stacked wood inside so I wouldn't have to go out in the dark. I locked the door again, checked the windows twice, and sat with the fire burning until my eyes hurt from the glow. The woods stayed quiet for a while. I thought maybe it was fine, maybe nothing would happen. Then came the thud. A single heavy thud on the side of the cabin. Not an animal brushing by. Not a branch falling. It was solid, intentional. I froze in my chair, staring at the wall. A minute passed. Then another thud, lower this time, closer to the ground, like someone pressed their weight against the boards. I didn't move for what felt like hours. My mind kept circling one thought. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. I was 28 years old in the summer of 2016 when I decided to rent a cabin up in northern Montana near Flathead National Forest. It wasn't one of those luxury lodges with polished wood floors and big glass windows looking out over a lake. This was smaller, older, and more stripped down. The listing made it sound rustic but cozy, with just enough comfort to keep it livable. A wood stove, propane lights, a water pump, and a little generator that was only meant to be used sparingly. I wanted quiet. I had been living in Seattle for the past 5 years, and between the constant traffic, the endless construction, and the noise of my own neighbors who seemed to never stop yelling at each other through thin apartment walls, I was at a point where silence felt like a luxury. I wanted to hear my own thoughts. I wanted air that smelled like pine instead of exhaust fumes. I wanted space around me that stretched farther than the few feet of carpet in a studio apartment. The drive up there was long. I left Seattle before sunrise, my car packed with groceries, a couple of suitcases, and a cooler filled with ice, meat, and drinks. By the time I passed through Kalispell, the roads got emptier, the trees thicker, and the mountains larger. The cabin wasn't right off the road. The last 6 miles were on a narrow dirt track, the kind where you worry if your car will bottom out in the ruts or if the rocks might puncture a tire. My cell phone lost signal halfway down that road, the little icon just dropping to no service. And I knew it would be that way the whole time. The cabin sat in a clearing that looked like someone had hacked it out of the forest with stubborn effort years ago. Grass grew unevenly around the front, and weeds crawled up near the porch. The structure itself was dark brown, the wood rough and weathered, with a tin roof that looked like it had been hammered back into place in spots. 2 small windows on the front, a simple porch with a sagging railing, and a door that was a little crooked in its frame. It wasn't pretty, not really, but it was solid. Inside, it smelled like cedar and old smoke. The first room had a small wood stove in one corner with a stack of split logs beside it. A table with 2 mismatched chairs stood under the front window. A single counter with a sink and a hand pump made up the kitchen, and shelves on the wall held a couple of cast iron pans and dented pots. A short hallway led to a small bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser. That was it. I unpacked slowly. I put my cooler by the counter, stacked canned food on the shelves, and laid out my sleeping bag on the bed even though there were sheets. The silence outside pressed in through the windows. I remember standing there after I'd finished unpacking and realizing there was no sound at all. No cars, no people, not even wind through the trees just then. The quiet wasn't comforting the way I thought it would be. It was thick, like a blanket pulled over my ears. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and sat at the table with a book, but I found myself glancing at the windows more often than I turned the pages. They were black squares after the sun went down, reflecting the lamplight inside. I couldn't see past them, but I kept catching myself thinking that maybe something could see in. I tried to ignore the feeling, told myself it was just the city in me, used to light and noise, making me paranoid about the dark. Still, when I finally went to bed, I shut the door to the bedroom and locked it, even though I knew nobody was supposed to be out there. The first few days passed quietly. I walked the dirt road in the mornings, took photos of the forest, and cooked simple meals on the stove. I even started to relax, the silence becoming more like what I had hoped for. But there were small things that didn't sit right with me. On the 3rd morning, when I went outside to split wood, I noticed a boot print in the dirt near the edge of the trees. It wasn't mine, it was larger, and the tread was different. At first I thought maybe it was old, left from someone who had stayed here before me, but the edges of the print were sharp, not softened by rain or time. It looked fresh. I looked around the clearing, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no one was there. I told myself it was probably the owner checking in before I arrived, maybe even a hunter passing through. Still, I kept thinking about it that whole day. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking down at the ground, checking for more. That night I heard something. Not much, just a soft crunch of leaves somewhere outside the cabin, close enough to catch my attention through the walls. I froze in bed, holding my breath. The sound came again, then stopped. I waited for what felt like forever, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening so hard that the blood rushing in my ears felt louder than anything else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I checked the ground again. This time, there were 2 prints near the side of the cabin, right below one of the windows. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was nothing, some hiker wandering through. But the cabin wasn't near any trail, and the prints were too close to the building, too deliberate. Someone had been right outside the window while I was sleeping. I remember standing there in the morning sun, staring at those prints, and feeling something I hadn't felt before. Not just unease, but a deep awareness that I was completely alone, and nobody would hear me if I needed help. My phone was dead out here. The nearest house or town was miles away. If someone wanted to walk out of those woods and come up to the cabin in the middle of the night, there was nothing to stop them. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably an animal. But the prints were clear, the shape of a boot, the tread obvious. I couldn't lie to myself about that. From then on, I stopped relaxing. I kept the door locked even during the day. I double-checked the windows before it got dark. When I walked the road, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The silence that I had come here for no longer felt peaceful. Felt like something was hiding inside it, waiting. I was 28 the summer I decided to get away from the city. My job in Minneapolis had been grinding me down, endless office hours and the constant noise of traffic pressing against me until I couldn't think clearly anymore. I rented a cabin 2 hours north, near a place called Big Rock Lake, mostly because it was cheap and tucked deep into the woods where no one I knew would ever bother me. I told myself I was going there for peace, to breathe air that didn't reek of exhaust fumes, to reset my head. But I had no idea how raw and uneasy real silence could feel when you were completely alone. The drive up had been smooth, long stretches of pine forest pressing against the narrow highway. The cabin was older than the pictures had shown. Its siding was faded gray, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch steps were soft with rot at the edges. Still, it was tucked close to the tree line, with a small clearing that opened to the lake about 50 yards away. I unpacked my few bags quickly, set my cooler on the porch, and carried in bottled water and canned food. I told myself it would be simple. A week of writing, reading, hiking, and sleeping. That first night, the quiet pressed down on me harder than expected. In the city, quiet always had a background hum. Distant sirens, cars on wet pavement, the thump of bass from a passing vehicle. Here there was nothing. The trees muffled even the smallest sounds. Inside, the cabin creaked in unfamiliar ways. The walls groaned lightly when the air cooled, and the rafters above me shifted as if weight pressed on them. I lay in bed staring at the knotty pine ceiling for hours, waiting for my body to relax. But each time I began to drift, I snapped awake at some sound I couldn't place. The second morning, I tried to force a routine. I boiled coffee on the propane stove and sat out on the porch facing the lake. The water was still, reflecting the pines and sky like a mirror. I tried to write in my notebook, but my mind wandered. I kept glancing at the tree line behind me, half expecting someone to step out. There was no one, just the tall, narrow pines packed close together, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I told myself it was the adjustment period, the brain misfiring from overstimulation and then sudden stillness. I hiked that afternoon along a narrow path that circled the lake. The ground was damp and soft, littered with pine needles that muffled my steps. At one point, about a mile out, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud. They were boot prints, not hiking shoes like mine, and much larger. I crouched to study them, noting how recent they looked, the edges still crisp, not yet smoothed by rain or wind. I thought maybe a fisherman, but I hadn't seen a single car on the way up, not even parked near the trailhead. The prints followed the trail in the same direction I was walking. My chest felt tight, but I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing unusual. By the time I looped back to the cabin, though, I was sweating despite the mild air. That night, I tried to read by lantern light, but my eyes kept lifting from the page toward the window. The cabin had no curtains, just bare panes of glass. Outside was total darkness, the kind you can't find anywhere near civilization. Every so often I thought I saw a flicker between the trees, a lighter patch of black shifting against the deeper dark. My pulse quickened each time, and I closed the book without finishing a single page. I slept in short bursts, waking to every settling sound of the old cabin. On the third morning, I found something that unsettled me far more than footprints. Near the edge of the porch, resting on the warped boards, was a crushed beer can. It hadn't been there before. I knew because I'd swept the porch clean of leaves when I arrived. The can was bent in half, silver with faded red lettering. I hadn't brought beer, only bottled water. I stood staring at it with my mug of coffee going cold in my hand. Maybe a raccoon dragged it up, I thought, but it was too clean, no tooth marks, no dirt stuck to the metal. I picked it up and set it on the railing, trying to convince myself it was just leftover from some long-ago visitor. But later that afternoon, while I sat on the dock at the lake with my feet in the water, I caught a clear reflection behind me in the ripples. For just a second, I saw a shape standing at the tree line, tall, still, and watching. When I spun around, the clearing was empty, the pines swaying gently but silent. My whole body felt wired, my scalp prickling, stomach turning over. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe just a tree in my peripheral vision, but I couldn't shake the certainty that I had been watched. That night, the air turned colder. The cabin popped and cracked louder than before. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, my ears straining at every sound. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside on the porch, a faint shift of weight on the boards. I held my breath so long it hurt. When I finally dared to move, I sat up, heart pounding, and listened harder. Nothing, but I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I kept still, gripping the flashlight in my hand until dawn bled gray through the glass. The following day, I decided to leave. I couldn't explain it neatly to myself, but the pressure of being alone out there, the signs that maybe I wasn't alone after all, were too much. I packed my things quickly, stuffing clothes into my duffel without folding. As I loaded the car, I heard movement in the woods. Not an animal, too steady, too heavy. I froze, staring into the trees. Again, nothing visible, just trunks and needles and shadows. I slammed the trunk shut and climbed behind the wheel. The engine wouldn't start. I turned the key again, pumping the pedal, but the car only sputtered. I checked the gauges, tried again and again until my hands shook. The battery light flickered briefly. I sat there gripping the wheel, sweat dampening the back of my shirt despite the cool morning. I had checked the car before leaving home. It was fine. Now, after days of feeling watched, it suddenly wouldn't start. I got out and lifted the hood, pretending to know more about engines than I did. Nothing obvious was wrong. The hoses and wires all looked intact. I tried the ignition once more. Nothing. My phone had no signal here. The nearest town was almost 20 miles south, all on a narrow 2-lane road. Walking it meant hours exposed, no guarantee of passing another car. My stomach nodded. I spent the day in restless motion, checking the car, pacing the porch, scanning the woods. That evening, as the sun sank, I spotted movement again at the tree line. Not just a trick of light this time. A figure stepped back into shadow the second I focused. My chest locked up. Someone was out there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside with my back to the wall, the lantern dim, a kitchen knife resting on the floor beside me. The cabin groaned and popped, but I heard clearer sounds this time. Soft footsteps circling, gravel crunching near the side of the house. Once, the door handle shifted, just slightly, but enough that I saw it tremble in the dim light. My throat went dry. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Hours dragged until faint morning light crept across the floorboards. By sunrise, I made my decision. Couldn't wait it out. I had to walk to the road, flag down anyone, even hike all the way to town if it came to that. I packed a backpack with water, a flashlight, the knife, and left the rest behind. As I locked the cabin door, I looked down and saw fresh mud smeared across the porch boards. Boot prints, large, recent, leading right up to the door. I walked fast, heart pounding, glancing back every few minutes. The trail through the woods seemed endless. Every sound made me spin, branches snapping, a crow flapping overhead, the rustle of leaves in the wind. After an hour, my legs ached, but I pushed harder. When I finally reached the highway, I stood on the shoulder gasping, eyes scanning the empty strip of asphalt stretching both ways. Not a car in sight. I walked south. My throat was dry, my hands slick on the straps of my pack. Another hour passed before I heard the distant rumble of an engine. I turned, waving both arms desperately. A dusty pickup slowed and pulled onto the gravel beside me. The driver leaned out, a man in his 50s with sun-creased skin and a baseball cap. He looked me over and asked if I needed a lift. I climbed in, every nerve still buzzing, and told him the car had broken down back at the lake. We rode in silence for a while, trees rushing past. I kept checking the side mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods. The man finally asked how long I'd been at the cabin. When I told him, he gave a small shake of his head. He said nobody rented that place anymore. The owner had stopped years ago after there were problems with strangers in the area. He didn't say more, just kept his eyes on the road. My stomach turned cold. When we reached town, I called a tow truck for my car, but I never went back to the cabin. I left the key with the sheriff's office and told them I wanted nothing more to do with it. That night, I checked into a small roadside motel, the kind with thin curtains and humming neon signs. The mattress sagged, the walls were stained, but for the first time in a week, I felt safe because there were people. I still don't know why I said yes to that trip. Maybe it was the thought of finally getting away from the noise of the city, or maybe it was just me trying to prove I wasn't afraid of being alone. Either way, in the summer of 2011, I packed my small bag, filled the tank of my beat-up Honda, and drove 5 hours north to a cabin a coworker had told me about. He said it was old but solid, hidden deep in the woods near the border of Montana, right by the edge of Glacier National Park. The drive up there had already started to feel strange. The farther I got from the main highway, the more the road narrowed into cracked 2-lane asphalt, then gravel, then finally just a dirt path that seemed barely wide enough for my car. Cell service had dropped miles earlier, and the GPS screen froze before disappearing completely, leaving me with nothing but printed directions scrawled on the back of a receipt. Every bend in the road made me wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, but the deeper I went, the harder it felt to justify turning back. By the time I found the cabin, the sun was slipping low behind the treeline. The cabin looked older than I imagined. The wood was dark, warped from years of weather, and the roof sagged just slightly in the middle. A small porch wrapped around the front, with 2 wooden chairs that didn't look like they'd hold much weight. The windows were smeared with dust, making it impossible to see inside. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, the sudden silence of the woods pressing in on me. It was a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the forest itself had paused to watch. I killed the headlights, stepped out of the car, and the gravel crunched louder than I expected under my shoes. The air smelled different here: pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. The key my coworker had given me was tied to a piece of red string. It stuck in the lock for a second before finally giving way. The door groaned open, and I stepped inside. The cabin wasn't much. A single main room with a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a small counter with an old propane stove. A short hallway led to a bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame and a bathroom that looked more like an afterthought. Just a metal sink, a toilet, and a shower with rust stains creeping down the tiles. There was no electricity. A few oil lamps sat on shelves, their glass chimneys dark with soot. A stack of wood leaned against the fireplace. The air inside was stale, as if no one had been there for months. I set my bag down on the bed and tried to shake off the unease crawling under my skin. I had planned this 3 days of quiet, away from emails, away from people, away from everything. I lit one of the lamps, the small flame flickering shadows across the walls, and decided to make a fire before the light vanished completely. By the time the fire was going, night had fully settled in. I heated a can of soup on the stove and ate it slowly, listening to the crackle of wood and the occasional pop as a log shifted. At first it felt comforting, almost like I was settling into something peaceful. But then I started hearing it, the faint sounds outside. At first I told myself it was just the woods, a branch snapping in the dark, leaves brushing together in the wind, maybe an animal moving through the undergrowth. I even repeated that to myself. Deer, raccoon, bear, normal things. But it wasn't just once. Kept happening, and every time it sounded closer. I tried not to stare too hard at the windows. They were just black squares now, reflecting the orange firelight from inside. Anything could be out there, pressed up against the glass, and I wouldn't know until it wanted me to. That night, I barely slept. I lay on the mattress, fully clothed, the blanket pulled to my chin, listening to every creak of the cabin. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving through the gravel by the porch. Other times it was softer, like someone brushing their hand against the wood siding. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then, right around 3 in the morning, there was a sound I couldn't mistake. A sharp knock, 3 raps, quick and firm, right on the wooden wall near the front door. I froze. My whole body went rigid under the blanket. I didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't dare blink. The knock didn't come again. Nothing followed. Just silence, so thick it made my stomach twist. I don't know how long I lay there, staring into the dark. Eventually exhaustion pulled me under, but it wasn't real sleep. It was restless, shallow, and when morning came, my head felt heavy, my eyes burning. The daylight made the cabin feel safer, almost normal. The fear from the night before seemed ridiculous in the sharp clarity of morning. I stepped outside with a mug of instant coffee and let the sunlight hit my face. The forest looked calm. Birds chirped from high in the branches. The air was cool and clean. But when I looked down at the dirt just past the porch steps, the mug trembled in my hand. Footprints. They weren't boots or sneakers or anything I could easily identify. Bare feet, wide and flat, pressed deep into the soil as if whoever or whatever had been standing there was heavy. They circled the cabin. Some were smaller, lighter, almost like a child's, while others were large, uneven, with toes spread unnaturally far apart. I followed them around to the back, my pulse racing harder with each step. The prints stopped near the window of the bedroom I'd slept in. The soil there was disturbed, the grass flattened, as if someone had been crouched low, peering in through the glass. I didn't want to admit what I was seeing. I told myself it had to be some local kids messing around, or maybe hikers who'd wandered too far. But the nearest town was more than an hour away, and the dirt road leading out here wasn't something you just stumbled across. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep myself busy, chopping wood, walking a short trail nearby, reading an old paperback I found stuffed in a drawer. But my eyes kept flicking to the windows, and every time I stepped outside, I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting. That night, I made the fire bigger, almost too big, just to fill the cabin with more light. I kept the oil lamp burning by the bed, though the fumes gave me a headache. Again, the noises started after midnight. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was a slow, steady scrape, like metal dragging against wood. It circled the cabin, stopping and starting, sometimes pausing for long stretches before continuing again. I gripped the handle of the fireplace poker and sat up in bed, my back pressed against the wall. My breathing was shallow, controlled, every nerve on edge. The scrape came to the window, paused, then moved toward the door. And then it stopped. Hours passed before I finally let myself relax, just a little. My grip on the poker loosened. My eyelids grew heavy. That's when I heard it, barely audible, but so clear I felt it in my bones. A whisper of breath. Not mine, not from inside, from just outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the curtain and knew, without question, that someone was standing inches away, separated from me by nothing but a thin sheet of glass. I never liked driving at night, but I had no choice that Friday. It was late October of 1998, and I was 26, driving out of the city toward the mountains in northern Colorado. I had rented a cabin for the weekend, something quiet and away from the noise. I had been working construction long hours for months, and the idea of being away from traffic, phones, and people felt like the only thing I needed. The cabin was old, listed cheap, and isolated, which made it perfect in my head. The drive had taken longer than I planned. The two-lane roads twisted through pine-covered hills, and the further I got, the darker it seemed to be. Even the moon looked faint, hidden behind layers of clouds. My headlights caught the thin gravel road that turned off the main highway, and my stomach tightened when I realized just how narrow and lonely it was. A cracked wooden sign leaned at the side of the turn, the paint almost gone, but I made out the words Willow Creek Cabins. I slowed down. The tires crunched against gravel as the trees swallowed me whole. No other lights, no other cars, just my beams cutting through the woods, and the endless dark pressing in on both sides. I kept driving for another 10 minutes, the road winding deeper into the forest, until I finally saw it. A squat wooden cabin sitting in a small clearing, a thin chimney rising above the roofline. I parked the car as close as I could to the porch. The place looked even older than the pictures had shown. The boards were weathered and gray, and the front steps sagged under their own weight. A single lantern light hung above the door, swaying gently in the cold wind, but it wasn't turned on. Everything looked deserted, like no one had been here in years. I grabbed my duffel bag from the car and walked up the steps. The wood groaned under my weight, and I noticed a missing plank that dipped into the damp earth below. The door was stiff, the lock clunky, but eventually it gave way with a heavy creak. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, pine, and something faintly sour, like damp fabric that had been sitting too long. I set my bag down by the door and looked around. The cabin was one big room except for a small bathroom in the back. To the left was a short couch with stuffing poking out the side, and to the right, a kitchen corner with a small table, a sink, and an old stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Against the far wall sat a fireplace, blackened with soot, with a stack of chopped wood beside it. Above it, a narrow staircase led to a loft that had a mattress on the floor. That would be my bed. The silence pressed down on me. It was the kind of silence that made your ears buzz. I walked around, touching the old furniture, trying to settle in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding. The cabin didn't feel welcoming. It felt abandoned, like the woods had been reclaiming it for years and I had interrupted. I unpacked a little, lit a couple of candles I found on the shelf, and tried to make it feel warmer. I had brought some food, cans, bread, and bottled water, so I stacked those on the table. I didn't plan on doing much, just sitting, maybe reading, sleeping, and letting my body relax. That was the plan. But the first night didn't feel like rest. After eating, I went to bed upstairs in the loft. The mattress was thin, springs poking my back, and the blanket smelled faintly of mildew. But I was tired enough to ignore it. I turned off the candles, pulled the blanket over me, and closed my eyes. The forest outside made its presence known. The wind moved through the trees with long, low moans. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Then silence returned so heavy I thought I had gone deaf. I must have drifted close to sleep when I heard it. A sharp crack, like a foot snapping a branch. My eyes opened. I told myself it was nothing. A deer maybe, or just the trees moving in the wind. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter. But then I heard it again, closer. Another snap, then the crunch of leaves under weight. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved slowly around the cabin. Crunch, pause, crunch. It wasn't random, not like an animal sniffing or darting. It was steady, circled. The air felt colder suddenly, though I knew it was just my nerves. I slid off the mattress as quietly as I could and crept to the edge of the loft, peeking over the railing. The cabin's windows were black mirrors in the dark. I could see nothing outside, only the faint outline of the trees against a starless sky. The sound stopped. I stood there, muscles locked, waiting for it to return. Minutes passed. Nothing. I finally crawled back to bed, forcing myself to believe it was a deer, maybe even more than one. I lay awake for hours, but no more sounds came. By morning, sunlight leaked through the cracks in the roof, and the cabin looked less threatening. I laughed at myself for being so tense. It was the woods, after all. Animals were everywhere. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled like pine. I made a small fire in the fireplace to shake off the chill, then stepped outside to get some air. The clearing looked empty. Trees surrounded the cabin in a tight circle, their trunks packed close together. The ground was damp with dew, and I noticed something odd. Patches of dirt disturbed near the edge of the trees, almost like prints. They weren't clear enough to make out, but the ground looked pressed down, heavier in some spots. I stared for a while, then forced myself to look away. It could have been anything, an elk, a bear, even just rain pooling oddly. Still, I went back inside quicker than I meant to. That second day, I tried to relax. I read a book, wrote in my notebook, and napped on the couch. For a while, it worked. But as the sun slid lower, I found myself glancing at the windows too often, waiting for the dark. By nightfall, I had built a bigger fire, hoping it would keep me calm. The light danced against the cabin walls, making shadows twitch and stretch. I ate dinner, just canned beans and bread, and tried to ignore the way the silence kept pressing in. When I finally lay back down in the loft, it didn't take long before the noises started again. A crunch, a deliberate step, then another. This time, it came from the back of the cabin, the bathroom wall. The sound scraped closer, like weight dragging across damp leaves. I sat up, staring at the black windows, my throat dry. My heart pounded so hard I thought the sound would give me away. It circled again, slow, patient, always just out of sight. I sat there until my legs cramped. Hours must have passed before the sound finally drifted away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I searched outside again. The dirt looked more disturbed than before, patches leading from one side of the cabin to the other. I crouched, pressing my fingers into the indentations, but they were too smeared to be clear. Bigger than deer prints, though, heavier, almost like boots. I stood there, staring at the trees. They stared back, silent and endless. I was 29 the year I decided to rent the cabin. It was early October 1998, and I had been working a long stretch of shifts at the plant in Columbus, Ohio. The noise, the heat, the smell of burnt oil and metal had been sitting in my head for weeks. My manager had told me to use the vacation days I had stacked up, or I'd lose them. I didn't have any plans to fly anywhere or spend money on hotels, but I wanted distance. A friend of a friend mentioned a cabin in the hills of West Virginia, near a lake, cheap to rent, quiet, no neighbors around for miles. That sounded good enough for me. The drive out took about 6 hours. I left before dawn, just me and the truck rattling on the highway. The air was colder than I expected. My windows fogged, and every time I stopped for gas, the wind bit through my jacket. As I got farther away from the city, the roads narrowed. Gas stations became small general stores with 1 or 2 old pumps. I stopped at a store outside a little town called New Creek and bought canned soup, bread, coffee, and a pack of matches. The man at the counter gave me a look when I told him where I was staying. He didn't say anything about it, just counted my change slowly and slid it across the counter. I noticed the way his hands looked rough, like someone who worked with wood or rope. The cabin was about 8 miles down a road that barely deserved to be called a road. It was dirt and gravel, uneven, with patches washed out from rain. My truck bounced and creaked. Trees pressed close on both sides, tall, thin trunks with leaves already turning yellow and orange. I remember thinking how quiet it felt. No traffic noise, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just wind in the trees, and once in a while, the distant tap of a woodpecker. The cabin itself sat back from the road, past a clearing of tall grass and weeds. The roof looked old but solid. The wood siding had gone gray, but not rotted. The porch sagged a little on one side, but when I stepped on it, it held. Inside, the air was stale but not terrible. It smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. The windows had shutters, and most of them were shut tight. The main room had a fireplace, a sagging couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a small shelf with a lantern and some old magazines stacked crooked. The kitchen had a rusty sink and a propane stove. In the back was one small bedroom with a cot and thin mattress. There was no power. I knew that before I came, but it hit me harder when I set my bags down. No hum of a refrigerator, no switch to flip for light, no outlet to charge my radio. I lit one of the kerosene lamps left on the shelf and set it on the table. The glow spread across the room and made the corners look darker. That first night, I cooked canned soup on the stove and ate it straight from the pot. I drank instant coffee that tasted bitter and left a grainy film on my tongue. After dinner, I sat on the porch with my jacket zipped up and listened to the woods. The silence was thick, like something pressing against me. In the distance, I could hear the lake moving, a low slap of water against the shore. Once, I heard branches snap deeper in the trees, heavy enough that I knew it wasn't a squirrel, probably a deer. Still, my chest tightened, and I stared into the trees longer than I needed to. When I finally lay down on the cot, the mattress springs groaned. I pulled my sleeping bag over me and kept the lantern burning low. I told myself I'd blow it out after I felt settled, but I never did. I drifted off with that weak glow stretching shadows across the ceiling. The second day, I walked down to the lake. It was bigger than I expected, water dark and smooth, reflecting the sky. The shoreline was lined with rocks, many of them sharp. No footprints, no sign of fishing, no docks. I crouched down and touched the water. It was colder than I thought it would be, colder than October should have made it. I stayed there for a while, throwing rocks in and listening to the hollow plunk as they sank. On the way back, I noticed boot tracks on the dirt path near the cabin. They weren't mine. The heel and toe were deeper, heavier than my step. The mud was still wet in some spots, so I could see the ridges clearly. Someone had been there since the rain that morning. I looked around, into the trees, but didn't see anyone. I told myself maybe it was from a hunter, someone passing through. Still, when I got back inside, I slid the wooden bolt across the door, even though I hadn't thought to do it before. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat at the table with the lantern, turning the flame up and down, just watching the shadows stretch and shrink. Every sound outside seemed sharper. A crack of a branch, the scrape of something small in the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. At one point, I thought I heard steps on the porch. Slow, careful steps. I froze, my hand around the lantern handle. But after a long minute, it was gone. No knock, no noise, just the wind picking up. I barely slept. The third day, I tried to distract myself. I walked the woods behind the cabin, counted how many ridges I could climb before losing sight of the roof. I found an old fire ring made of stones, black with soot, half buried under weeds. Someone had camped there years ago. I wondered if they ever stayed in the cabin or if they knew about it. When I got back, I saw something on the porch, a piece of rope, coiled neatly. It hadn't been there when I left. I didn't carry rope with me. I picked it up. It was rough, thick, with little fibers sticking into my palm. I didn't know what to do with it, so I set it on the shelf inside. My chest felt tight again, and I couldn't shake the idea that someone had left it there for me to find. That night was worse. I heard definite footsteps outside, circling. Not running, not rushing, slow, steady. Gravel shifted. Boards creaked. Once, the doorknob rattled, just a little. I held my breath and stayed still on the cot, gripping the flashlight I'd brought from home. The bolt on the door held. After maybe an hour, the sounds faded. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for them to come back. By the fourth day, I was worn down. My eyes ached. My head felt heavy. I thought about packing up and driving back to Ohio. But the thought of driving that road half asleep scared me almost as much as staying. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that I was just not used to being alone, that every sound carried louder in the woods. But then, in the late afternoon, I found cigarette butts behind the cabin. Fresh ones, not old and dry. Someone had been standing there, close, smoking and watching. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I packed fast. I shoved clothes into my bag, left most of the food behind, and dragged everything to the truck. The sun was already dropping behind the trees, and the clearing was filling with shadow. As I loaded the last bag, I heard movement in the woods. Heavy movement like someone running. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine finally turned over, relief washed through me, but it lasted only a second. Headlights swept the trees as I turned the truck around, and in that light, I saw a figure just at the tree line. Tall, wearing dark clothes, standing still, facing me. I didn't stop to look closer. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the road, gravel spitting out from the tires. My chest felt like it was going to burst. I checked the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing. Only the dark road winding back through the hills. By the time I hit the highway, my hands had cramped from gripping the wheel so hard. I didn't stop until I reached a motel 2 hours away, one of those cheap places with buzzing neon signs. Inside the room, with the TV on low and the hum of traffic outside, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I never went back for the food I left. I never told the owner why I left early. I never even told my friends the full story. All I know is someone was out there with me, someone who wasn't just passing through, someone who wanted me to know they were there. And I think about the rope. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to take a trip up north to a cabin I had rented through a small listing I found online. The place was tucked into the far end of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a stretch of forest and lakes that most people never see unless they've got family up there or a reason to vanish for a while. I was 33 at the time, worn out from city life, and all I wanted was quiet. No phone calls, no traffic, no neighbors stacked on top of each other in narrow apartments. The cabin looked plain in the photos, weathered with siding, a tin roof, a chimney that leaned a little to the right, but it had running water, electricity from a generator, and most importantly, it sat on a patch of land so far from anyone else that you could walk a mile in any direction and still only see trees. The drive out there was longer than I expected. It took nearly 10 hours from where I lived in Milwaukee. Most of it spent cutting through highways that emptied into smaller state roads and finally into dirt paths that weren't marked on any GPS. I remember the last stretch well. The tires bumping over rocks, mud splattering the side mirrors, and the woods growing so thick that the late afternoon sun barely reached the ground. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sky was turning gray, and the air had that heavy, damp smell that promised colder nights ahead. The cabin itself looked smaller than in the photos. It had one door, a small porch with 3 steps, and 2 windows at the front, one of them cracked slightly at the corner. The trees pressed in close around it, almost too close, like the forest wanted to swallow the structure whole. I cut the engine, stepped out, and stood for a moment listening. No traffic, no voices, not even birds, just the creak of trees shifting in the wind and the faint tick of the truck's engine cooling. Inside, the place smelled of old wood and dust. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a couch with sagging cushions. A small hallway led to a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser with 1 drawer missing. The bathroom was barely more than a closet with a toilet and a sink that sputtered brown water until it cleared. Everything about it felt worn, lived in, but not cared for. I wasn't picky, though. I had come for the silence, and the cabin delivered. The first night passed without issue. I heated a can of soup on the stove, sat by the small window watching the trees bend under the weight of the wind, and eventually fell asleep on the couch, too tired to bother unpacking. The generator hummed outside until I switched it off, and then there was only darkness. A kind of darkness that felt heavier than anything in the city, thick, pressing, absolute. By the second day, I started noticing little details that didn't sit right. The back door, which led to a small shed, had scratch marks near the handle, like someone had tried prying it open with a tool. The woodpile stacked against the wall looked freshly cut, but the ad had mentioned the cabin hadn't been rented for months. The biggest thing was the notebook I found tucked between the couch cushions. It was small, the kind you buy in bulk at drugstores with pages curled from damp. Most of it was blank, but in the middle there were a few pages filled with handwriting. The writing was messy, hurried, like someone had scrawled it while half panicked. It mentioned noises at night, footsteps outside the cabin, and the feeling of being watched. The last line read, "If you find this, don't stay after dark." I set the notebook aside and told myself it was nothing. Probably just some teenager who had stayed there before, trying to scare whoever came next. The human mind looks for stories in everything, and I didn't want to fall into that trap. Still, that night when I lay down in the bedroom, I left the light on. The old bulb buzzed faintly above me, and I stared at the ceiling until I drifted off. Sometime deep into the night, I woke to a sound. It wasn't loud, not enough to shock me upright, but enough to pull me out of sleep. A crunch, steady, like weight pressing down on leaves or snow. My first thought was deer, they moved through these woods often. But as I listened, the steps didn't wander or scatter the way animals usually did. They were steady, deliberate, circling the cabin. My skin prickled. I stayed in bed, holding still, counting the seconds between each sound. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, then to the front porch, then back again. I could almost picture someone walking the perimeter, checking it, slow and patient. Eventually, the noise faded, and the forest went back to silence. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside and checked around. The dirt was damp from last night's rain, and I found marks near the porch. Not clear footprints, more like pressed shapes, scuffs, as if someone had walked carefully but couldn't erase all evidence. They were too large to be from an animal, too uneven to be boots. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it could have been an old mark, washed out by the rain. For the next 2 days, I kept to routine. Chopped some of the wood, read an old book I had brought, and took short walks along the dirt path. Every evening, though, I felt the same thing, like eyes were on me once the sun dipped low. I started locking the doors as soon as it got dark, double-checking the windows, even dragging a chair under the doorknob. The sounds came back each night. Footsteps, sometimes closer, sometimes distant, but always moving with a strange rhythm. Not random, not animal. By the fourth night, I was wired with nerves. I stayed up, sitting by the table with a lantern lit, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again. Steps on the porch. This time, the boards creaked. My throat tightened. I stared at the door, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The handle shifted slightly, just enough to make the latch click. Whoever was out there tried turning it slow, testing it. The chair under the knob held firm. After a few seconds, the pressure stopped. Silence again. When daylight finally came, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked the tree line, scanning the ground. I found a spot about 50 yards from the cabin where the grass was pressed flat. It looked like someone had been sitting there for a long time, maybe watching. The thought made my stomach turn. I packed my bag that afternoon, ready to leave the next morning. But that night turned out worse than all the others. I shut off the generator early, hoping the silence would make whoever was out there lose interest. I lay on the couch with my boots still on, too restless to sleep. Sometime after midnight, glass shattered in the back. My body froze. The bedroom window, I heard, would scrape, then the shuffle of feet inside the cabin. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the front door, into the dark. The forest swallowed me, branches snapping against my jacket, mud pulling at my shoes. Behind me, I thought I heard movement, but I didn't turn around. I kept running until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, bent over and gasping, the cabin was far behind me. I spent the rest of the night crouched against a fallen log, every sound in the woods amplified, every shadow a threat. At first light, I made my way back to the dirt road and followed it until I reached the main road hours later. I never went back for my truck, never went back for anything. A few weeks later, I looked online, curious. The listing for the cabin was gone. No records, no mention of who owned it. Almost like it had never existed. But I remember the footsteps. I remember the way the handle turned, slow and patient. Whoever was out there hadn't been passing through. They had been waiting, and I was just lucky enough to leave before they decided to come inside. I was 26 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in the woods. It wasn't planned as some grand adventure or a test of survival. I just wanted space, away from people, away from noise, away from the city that had been eating me alive for years. A friend of mine had told me about an old cabin his uncle owned, tucked somewhere in the northern part of Idaho, far out past the last town on the map. It hadn't been used much in years, but it still stood strong enough to sleep in. He gave me the directions in a messy notebook, half-scribbled lines about dirt roads and landmarks that barely sounded real. But that was what I wanted, something that felt disconnected from everything I knew. The drive alone was long enough to make me question whether I should have even gone. I left the city behind in the early morning, and by the time I was following a cracked two-lane highway through stretches of pine and hills, it already felt like I was moving backward in time. Gas stations got smaller and fewer. The last grocery store I stopped at before turning off onto gravel roads looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 1980s. I bought too much canned food, bottled water, some matches, and a pack of cheap batteries. It wasn't because I thought I'd need that much, but because the thought of running out of anything out there started to bother me. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low. The place looked like something that had been forgotten on purpose. The roof sagged a little, the wooden siding had faded gray, and the small porch was coated in dirt and needles from the surrounding trees. It was one room, from what I could see through the grimy window, with a narrow chimney poking out of one side. No electricity, no plumbing. The outhouse stood maybe 50 feet away, half hidden by brush. I told myself it was fine. I had known it was going to be primitive. That was the point. I parked my car on the uneven patch of ground near the porch and hauled my stuff inside. The door stuck hard against the frame when I opened it, groaning like it hadn't been moved in years. Inside smelled like stale wood and something faintly metallic like rust. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the last stretch of sunlight slanting through the single window. There was a bed frame with an old mattress that looked like it would collapse if I put too much weight on it, a wood stove in the corner, and a table that leaned to one side. Bare bones, but enough. I set up a sleeping bag on the bed frame instead of trusting the mattress, stacked my food on the table, and filled the silence with the little noises of moving around. The woods outside pressed close against the walls, every sound sharper now that there was nothing else to cover it. I could hear birds shifting high up in the branches, the sudden crack of a twig, the way wind rattled leaves. By the time the sun dropped completely, I had lit a couple of candles and sat on the porch steps, watching the trees fade into black shapes against the sky. That first night was harder than I expected. I thought I'd be able to sleep, but the quiet wasn't quiet at all. It was layers of sound I wasn't used to. Scratching, scurrying, creaks in the wood, something distant that could have been an animal moving through brush. Every time I started to drift off, a new noise cut through and pulled me awake again. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on trying to sleep and just sat up in the dark, staring at the thin outline of the window. I told myself it was only nerves, that I'd adjust after a night or two. By the second day, I was already noticing how isolated the place really was. There were no trails nearby, no signs of other people at all. When I walked out past the trees behind the cabin, I didn't see anything except more woods rolling out in every direction. No power lines, no fences, not even trash left behind. Just endless green and brown. I should have felt relieved that I was really alone, but instead, it left me unsettled. Felt too empty, too removed. I spent the afternoon chopping some of the old firewood stacked by the cabin, though most of it was damp and rotted. The axe was dull, and every swing felt like it echoed too far. By evening, I had a small pile of usable logs, enough to keep the wood stove burning through the night. I cooked a can of beans directly in the pot on the stove, the taste metallic but warm. When darkness came again, it felt heavier than the night before. That was when the first strange thing happened. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the outside wall. At first, I thought it was just a branch in the wind, scraping the siding. But the cabin was too far from any trees for that. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, like weight shifting along the wood. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. It circled, soft at first, then sharper. Footsteps? No, not footsteps. More like something dragging across the ground. I stayed awake until the sound stopped, maybe an hour later, though I couldn't be sure. My throat was dry, and every muscle in my body was tense. When silence finally settled back over the cabin, I didn't move until the gray light of morning filtered in. The next day, I walked a wide circle around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was uneven, soft in some places, packed in others, and covered with needles. Nothing clear. Maybe I was imagining it. I told myself, maybe it had been an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Something ordinary. I tried to shake it off. But that night, it happened again. This time, the sound started earlier, just after I had blown out the candle. A low scraping, then a pause, then another scrape. I held my breath, staring into the dark, every sound magnified in my skull. Then came a dull thud, like something bumping against the corner of the cabin. Not hard, but heavy. My stomach nodded. I thought about turning on my flashlight, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stayed still until exhaustion forced me into a shallow, broken sleep. By the fourth day, my nerves were raw. I hadn't slept more than a few hours in total. Every creak of the cabin sounded loaded. Every gust of wind outside felt like it carried something with it. I tried to distract myself by hiking further into the woods during the day, but the silence there was worse. No birds, no insects, just stillness. When I realized how far I had walked without marking anything, panic set in, and I hurried back, heart hammering, afraid I wouldn't find the cabin again. That night, the sound changed. Instead of scraping or bumping, it was tapping. Slow, rhythmic, against the wall near the window. I stared at the glass, half expecting a face to appear, though I knew how ridiculous that was. The tapping went on for what felt like hours, uneven but steady enough to make me feel like it wasn't random. My chest tightened with every sound. When I finally got up the nerve to shine my flashlight out the window, the beam hit nothing but the reflection of my own pale face. By the sixth night, I was falling apart. I barely ate. My hands shook. My body felt hollowed out by the constant strain of waiting for the sounds to come back. And they did, always just after dark, always circling, tapping, brushing. Sometimes it felt like more than one source, like it was coming from opposite sides of the cabin at once. I tried yelling once, slamming the butt of the axe against the wall, hoping it would scare whatever it was away. The woods swallowed the sound whole. On the seventh day, I decided I couldn't stay anymore. I was 29 when I decided to take a week off work and drive out to the woods of Gray Pines, a small area in northern Montana. It was late October, 2014, and the weather had already begun its shift toward winter. The cabin I rented wasn't anything fancy, just an old wooden place that used to be a hunting lodge back in the 70s. The listing said it was secluded, peaceful, and private. That was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't after comfort. I was after silence, time away from everything, time to breathe. The drive out there was long. I remember the highway narrowing into two-lane roads, the pine trees rising higher the further north I went. By the time I reached the dirt road that cut into the property, my cell signal was already dead. I had prepared for that. I had downloaded maps, packed extra food, and left a note with my sister that I wouldn't be back until the following Sunday. The cabin sat about 2 miles off the main road. The dirt track leading there was uneven, littered with potholes and patches of mud. My SUV bounced hard a few times, but eventually, I came through a clearing and saw it. One story made of dark timber, with a tin roof that was beginning to rust in places. A narrow porch stretched across the front, and off to the right was a small shed with a broken padlock hanging loose. When I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me first. No cars, No voices, not even the distant hum of anything man-made. Just wind moving through the trees and the occasional caw of a raven overhead. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dust. The main room had a small couch, a table, and a stone fireplace with ashes still piled inside, as if someone had used it not too long ago. The kitchen area was cramped, with only a tiny propane stove and a sink connected to a hand pump. In the back were 2 bedrooms, one with a twin bed, the other with a double mattress that sagged in the middle. There was no electricity, no running water except for the pump, and the only heat came from the fireplace and an old cast-iron wood stove in the kitchen. I had brought firewood, but I also noticed a stack of logs piled under a tarp behind the shed. Someone had been using the place regularly enough to keep it stocked. The first night was calm. I lit a fire, cooked some canned soup on the stove, and sat by the window reading by lantern light until I grew tired. The woods outside pressed against the glass like a heavy curtain. When I finally laid down, I slept harder than I had in weeks. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was thick with pines and birch, the ground soft with layers of needles and leaves. About half a mile out, I found a stream cutting through the trees, its water cold and clear. I crouched down, listening to it rush over rocks, and I felt something strange then. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness. I was very much alone. Every twig snapping under my boots sounded louder than it should. Back at the cabin, I split firewood for the stove. As the sun went down, the air dropped to near freezing. By nightfall, I had both the fireplace and stove burning. The warmth filled the cabin, but the silence pressed heavier than before. I noticed then how dark it truly got out there. No glow from nearby towns, no headlights passing in the distance. Just blackness swallowing everything outside the weak lantern light. That night, I woke around 2 in the morning. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down, the cabin was cold, and the silence was almost painful. I laid there listening, and then I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves outside, near the shed. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. But the steps were slow, spaced too far apart, and deliberate. I stayed in bed, holding my breath. The sound moved along the side of the cabin, then stopped. I waited, heart hammering. Minutes stretched, and finally, nothing followed. I told myself it had been nothing, maybe just my imagination twisting small noises into something bigger. In the morning, I checked outside. Frost clung to the grass, but in the mud near the shed, I saw it clearly. A footprint. Not a boot print like mine, but something older, worn down. The heel was uneven, like the sole of a work boot that had seen years of use. The tread pattern was faint, almost smoothed away, but it was there. Someone had been walking outside last night. My stomach nodded, but I told myself again it could have been left days ago, maybe even weeks. Hunters came through these woods all the time. Still, the fact that it was right by the shed, right where I had heard the noise, stayed in my head all day. The days blurred after that. I tried to distract myself with books, chopping wood, and walking the trails near the stream. But at night, the unease grew worse. The third night, I heard something again. This time, it was closer. A faint tap against the cabin wall, as if someone brushed their hand along the logs. Then silence. I sat in bed, clutching the flashlight I kept beside me, staring at the door until my eyes ached. Nothing came of it. No forced entry, no windows broken. Just quiet until morning. When daylight came, I circled the cabin again. Near the back wall, I found another footprint, clearer this time. Same worn sole, same uneven heel. My throat tightened as I crouched over it. Someone was out here, moving around the cabin at night. By the 4th day, my nerves were thin. I started stacking firewood against the inside of the door when I went to sleep, not because I thought it would stop someone, but because I wanted to hear it crash if the door opened. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling. I held the flashlight tight, staring at the door, and then something new. A faint scrape, metal against wood. My chest tightened. It was at the shed. The broken padlock. Someone was inside. I didn't move until hours later when dawn finally came. When I stepped outside, the shed door was cracked open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, the shelves were empty except for rusted tools. The floor was disturbed, muddy footprints everywhere. Whoever had been here wasn't hiding the fact anymore. By the 5th day, I wanted to leave. Every sound outside set me on edge, and the thought of another night in the cabin made me feel sick. But the problem was the road. It had rained overnight, and when I drove down the dirt track to leave, the SUV sank in a rut of mud halfway out. I tried rocking it back and forth, spinning the tires, but all I did was dig deeper. I was stuck. I hiked back to the cabin, cold and furious at myself for not leaving sooner. I kept telling myself I could wait it out until the ground dried, but that meant at least 2 more nights. 2 more nights of whoever was out there walking around. That evening, I lit the fire early and sat in the corner of the room with my back against the wall, lantern low, flashlight in hand. I barely blinked, just staring at the windows, waiting. Came after midnight again. Slow steps, pressing into the leaves, circling closer. Then, for the first time, I heard the porch creak. My skin went cold. Someone was standing just feet from the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then, a soft rattle of the doorknob. I had wedged the firewood against it, and the sound stopped. Silence followed, thick and endless. At some point, exhaustion must have taken me because I woke to sunlight creeping through the window. The porch was empty. I checked the door. The knob was scratched, as if a knife blade or some sharp tool had been pressed against it. By the 6th day, fear had turned to anger. I wasn't going to sit and wait anymore. I carried the hatchet from the woodpile inside with me, leaving it by the bed. I kept the fire going around the clock, not for warmth, but for light. I didn't step outside except to use the outhouse, and even then, I scanned the tree line constantly. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat awake, heart pounding, staring at the door. The sounds came again. Footsteps, circling, deliberate. Then silence. Hours dragged, and finally, I heard it. The shed door slamming shut. I don't know what came over me, but I snapped. I grabbed the hatchet, yanked open the cabin door, and stormed outside, screaming into the trees. The cold air cut my lungs, my voice echoing through the forest. I swung the lantern around, but the clearing was empty. I checked the shed. Nothing, just mud and silence. I stood there, chest heaving, every nerve buzzing, until finally I went back inside and barred the door again. That night, I didn't hear another sound. On the 7th morning, the ground had dried enough that I thought I could try again. I packed everything fast, heart racing, throwing supplies into bags. When I finally got the SUV free from the mud, the relief nearly made me dizzy. As I drove out, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat small and dark in the clearing, smoke from the chimney curling into the gray sky. And just as the trees closed around the road, I saw it. Someone standing at the edge. I never thought much about old cabins, at least not until that year. It was the summer of 1998, and I had just turned 27. I was living in Spokane, Washington, working long hours at a warehouse job that left me drained every night. I didn't make much money, but I saved up what I could. At the time, I didn't care about vacations or going to beaches or flying somewhere nice. I just wanted quiet. A friend of mine mentioned once that his uncle had a small hunting cabin out near Priest Lake, Idaho. It was barely used, he said. Just 4 wooden walls, a roof that didn't leak too bad, a stove, and a bed frame. No running water, no electricity. It sounded like the kind of place where a person could breathe without hearing the hum of traffic or the whine of machines. I borrowed it for a long weekend. My friend gave me vague directions. Follow the dirt road past the old sawmill ruins. Take the narrow track that cuts left into the trees. Keep driving until you can't. From there, he said, it was a short walk. I didn't think much of it. Back then, I didn't worry about things like getting lost. I had a paper map, a full tank of gas, and a stubborn kind of confidence. The first day started normal. The drive out was long, about 3 hours. The last part took me through narrow logging roads where my old Ford Ranger rattled over ruts and rocks. When I finally stopped, I found myself surrounded by thick trees, the kind of forest that swallows sound. I parked off to the side, slung my pack over my shoulder, and followed the faint path toward the cabin. It looked just like I expected. A squat wooden structure with faded gray boards, a tin roof streaked with rust, and a door that leaned a little crooked in its frame. The windows were small, dusty, and covered with simple wooden shutters. The clearing around it was overgrown with weeds and ferns, and a pile of chopped logs sat rotting near the stump of an old pine. Inside, the air smelled stale, like damp wood and old ash. There was a wood stove in one corner, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves nailed to the wall that held a few rusty cans and empty jars. Nothing about it felt welcoming, but that was fine with me. I hadn't come for comfort. I come for quiet. That first evening was calm. I gathered some fallen branches, got a fire going in the stove, and cooked a can of beans I'd brought. The woods outside were alive with sound. Crickets, the occasional snap of a twig, the wind moving through the branches. I sat at the table, eating slowly, enjoying how far away everything felt. No phones, no neighbors, no streetlights, just me and the woods. But as night fell, the quiet began to change. The insects hushed earlier than I expected, and the forest grew heavy with silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just different out here, just nature. But as I lay on the cot in the dark, I heard something faint outside. Not animals rustling in the brush. Heavier, steadier, like slow steps in the dirt. I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped. I thought maybe I imagined it. But then came another noise, a soft scrape, like wood dragging against wood. It was near the wall by the door. My chest tightened, but I didn't move. I stared at the dark ceiling, forcing myself to stay still. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the sound stopped completely. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I stepped outside, trying to shake off the unease. The ground around the cabin looked normal. No tracks, no disturbed brush, nothing. I convinced myself it must have been an animal nosing around. A deer, maybe. A bear, though I hoped not. I spent the day wandering the woods with my map and compass, making sure I could find my way back to the truck. The forest stretched on endlessly, shadows between the trunks. But as long as I stayed aware of the landmarks, the bent cedar, the mossy boulder, I felt fine. Back at the cabin that evening, I chopped some of the old logs into usable pieces, sweating hard under the humid air. I cooked rice over the stove, ate, then sat outside on the step as the sun slid down behind the trees. For a moment, it was perfect. The sky turning orange, the air cooling, the smell of pine heavy all around. But when the light faded, I noticed something strange. In the dirt near the edge of the clearing, where the grass grew thin, there were marks. Long, shallow grooves like someone had dragged a stick or a tool across the ground. They weren't there earlier. I crouched to look. The lines curved oddly, looping back and forth. Not random, but not clear enough to form words or shapes either. I ran my fingers over them, and the soil felt freshly disturbed. My skin prickled. I told myself it had to be some kind of animal behavior, maybe raccoons digging. But it didn't look like digging. It looked deliberate. That night, the sounds came back. I was lying on the cot in the dark, listening to the creaks of the cabin, when I heard them again. Footsteps, slow, circling, then silence, then a tap on the wall, so soft I almost thought I dreamed it. I sat up, holding my breath, heart pounding so hard it shook my ribs. The tapping came again, a little louder this time. Then it stopped. I waited, staring into the dark, until exhaustion finally dragged me into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, I checked again. On the far side of the cabin, in the dirt beneath the shuttered window, were more marks. This time they looked like lines crossing each other, like someone had dragged a stick back and forth deliberately. I felt watched. I was 28 years old the summer I decided to take a break from everything. It was 1997, and my life back in Cleveland felt like it was rotting from the inside. Too many long shifts, too many unpaid bills, too much noise every time I tried to think. The kind of noise you don't just hear, but feel in your chest when you're lying in bed at 3 in the morning wondering how you're supposed to keep it all together. That summer, I rented a cabin in northern Pennsylvania, a place tucked far enough into the pines that I could convince myself I was alone in the world. The owner was a man named Harold, older, the type that smelled like gasoline and always squinted even when the sun wasn't out. He gave me the key in a diner parking lot, sliding it across the hood of my car with a mutter about the lock being a little sticky, but fine. The cabin sat down a dirt road, 2 miles past where the gravel ended. My car bounced hard over the ruts, branches scratching against the doors, until finally the trees opened just enough to show a squat shape of wood and a sagging porch. The windows were clouded with dust. The roof had moss like a green rash. A single chimney stuck out the side, crumbling at the top. I stepped out of the car and the air hit me. Pine needles, damp earth, the sharp sweetness of wild grass. It was better than the city already. No horns, no radios, just wind moving through trees. I carried my bag up the steps and the boards flexed under my weight like they hadn't been tested in years. Inside, the place smelled old but dry, like firewood and something faintly metallic. There was one main room with a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a sagging couch. A small kitchen sat off to the side, the kind with a deep sink, yellowed counters, and cabinets that creaked when I opened them. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom with a bare mattress and a bathroom barely bigger than a closet. It wasn't much, but it was what I wanted. No phone, no TV, no neighbors close enough to hear. Just me and whatever I could make of the quiet. The first couple of days were uneventful. I stacked firewood, swept the porch, and tried to settle into the rhythm of being away. My meals were simple: beans, bread, canned soup, things I'd packed in boxes. I spent the afternoons walking through the woods, listening to the crunch of pine needles under my boots, following deer trails until I worried I'd lose my way. At night, I'd light a candle, read an old paperback I brought along, then lie on the mattress listening to the night outside. It should have been peaceful, but the quiet wasn't what I expected. It wasn't empty. The nights seemed to press in too much, the silence too heavy. Every creak of the cabin felt sharp, every gust of wind like a hand brushing against the walls. I told myself it was just the adjustment. The city had left me wound tight. Out here, my brain was just trying to fill the space. On the 4th night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the stillness. A crunch like a footstep on gravel. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart thumping. Another crunch, closer. I sat up, straining my ears. The cabin had no curtains, and the moonlight spilled across the floor. For a long time, I didn't move. Finally, I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. In the morning, I went outside to check. The soil near the porch was soft, damp from rain the night before. I crouched and looked. There were prints pressed sharp into the mud. Not hooves, not paws, boots. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little bigger. They led from the tree line to the porch steps, then turned back again. My stomach twisted as I followed them with my eyes. Whoever it was had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. I tried to think of explanations. Maybe Harold came by to check on the place. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. But if either were true, why not knock? Why come at night? Why walk up to the porch and then leave? I spent the day restless, pacing the cabin, listening for noises in the woods. By late afternoon, I forced myself to go for a walk to clear my head. The trees closed in around me, tall and dark, their trunks straight like bars. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Every snapping twig made me turn. Every shadow looked wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in the chair by the window, a candle burning low, staring out at the dark. My chest ached from how hard my heart was beating. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Finally, near dawn, I dozed off. The next day, I told myself I was being stupid. It was one night, one set of prints. I couldn't let paranoia ruin the whole trip. I tried to stick to my routine. I swept the porch, cooked oatmeal, wrote in a notebook I'd brought. But every so often I caught myself staring out the window, waiting for something to move. It was the sixth night when things turned worse. I woke again to a sound. This time it was sharper. A scrape, metal against wood. My eyes flew open, and I lay rigid, ears straining. Another scrape, closer this time, near the front door. My mouth went dry. The lock. Someone was at the lock. I sat up, heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The door rattled once, then stilled. The cabin was silent again, but the silence was worse than any noise. I didn't move for what felt like hours. My whole body trembled, waiting for the knob to turn, for the door to push open. But it never did. Eventually, the sounds stopped. When the sun came up, I checked the door. The wood around the lock was scratched, thin lines gouged into the frame. Someone had tried to force it. I didn't know what to do. The cabin had no phone. My car was parked at the edge of the clearing, but the road out was rough, and if someone blocked it, I'd be trapped. I thought about leaving right then, but fear kept me rooted. If whoever it was still out there, waiting, I'd be walking right into them. So I stayed. I barricaded the door with the table and stacked firewood against the back window. I kept the hatchet I'd found in the shed close by, carrying it from room to room. I didn't go for walks anymore. I barely stepped outside. I sat inside the cabin, muscles aching from tension, ears tuned to every sound. Nights became endless stretches of waiting. Sometimes I'd hear movement outside, branches cracking, leaves shifting. Once, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the trees, but when I blinked it was gone. On the ninth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag, grabbed the keys, and decided to drive out before the sun set. I wasn't sleeping anyway. I told myself I'd rather take my chances on the road than rot in that cabin waiting for something worse. But when I got to the car, my chest went cold. The tires were slashed, all four of them, long cuts down the rubber, ragged and deep. My legs nearly gave out. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch the car, close enough to know I couldn't leave now. I stumbled back inside, locked the door, shoved the table harder against it. Panic pulsed through me in waves, rising and falling, never leaving. I thought of walking out, of trying to make it down the road on foot, but 2 miles through those woods felt impossible. That night, I barely breathed. The candle flickered on the table. My hands stayed wrapped around the hatchet handle until my fingers cramped. Near midnight, the sounds started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the dirt around the cabin. They circled once, twice, then silence. I sat frozen, eyes burning from not blinking. Then came the sound that broke me, the porch steps groaning under weight. Whoever it was had come back. The knob rattled once, twice, then stopped. The table shivered against the door as pressure pressed against it from outside. My chest seized, then nothing, just breathing, not mine, low, steady, just on the other side of the wood. I stayed like that until the sun finally started to bleed through the trees. When I dared to look, the prints were there again, deep, heavy, leading away into the forest. I didn't sleep after that. I didn't eat much either. My whole world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the windows, the door. Every second was waiting. On the 11th day, I decided to leave on foot. I couldn't survive much longer like this. I packed light water, a few cans, the hatchet tucked through my belt. I left the cabin just after sunrise, when the woods felt emptiest. My steps crunched loud on the dirt, and every sound made my stomach flip. I kept walking, forcing my legs to move faster, scanning the trees. My breaths came in sharp bursts. The sun rose higher, and sweat dripped into my eyes. The road stretched ahead like it never would end. But I made it. 2 hours later, I stumbled into the diner parking lot where Harold had first given me the key. My legs shook, my throat raw, but I was out. I didn't go back for the car. I didn't go back for my things. I never heard who it was or why they came. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that someone wanted me afraid in that cabin, and they got what they wanted. And to this day, when I hear a floorboard creak or a door rattle in the night, my body goes I was 31 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin I had rented in northern Minnesota. It was the summer of 2012, late July, the kind of hot but restless weather that carried storms out of nowhere. I had taken a week off work, telling myself I needed the time away from people, away from my phone buzzing all the time, away from traffic and buildings stacked too close together. The cabin seemed perfect on the listing, small, old, and sitting by itself near a lake, with thick woods surrounding it. The man who owned it told me it was about 20 minutes from the nearest paved road, which sounded exactly like what I wanted. I left home before dawn and drove most of the day, crossing into Minnesota from Wisconsin. The further I went north, the thinner the traffic became. Towns grew smaller, gas stations fewer, until eventually there were stretches of road with nothing but trees on both sides. When I finally turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, my tires kicked up clouds of dust that lingered in the air. The road wound through the woods in long curves, the branches above hanging low enough to scrape against the roof now and then. The sun had already started lowering, throwing long shadows across the dirt and turning everything an amber color. When I pulled up to the cabin, I cut the engine and just sat there for a moment, taking it in. It wasn't much, just a squat wooden structure with a rust-colored roof, the paint peeling from the siding, a screened porch in front. The lake stretched out behind it, still and dark, with a line of cattails along the edge. The air smelled heavy, like pine and damp soil. I unloaded my bags and carried them inside. The cabin's interior was exactly as expected. Old wooden floorboards, scuffed and uneven. A single bedroom with a narrow bed. A small kitchen with an outdated stove and a fridge that hummed loudly as if it were about to die. The bathroom had an ancient sink and a shower stall lined with plastic that curled at the edges. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, no clock on the wall. Only a few bare light bulbs and a lantern by the door. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I unpacked a little and sat on the porch with a beer, watching the lake. The sun slid down behind the trees, turning the water dark purple. The woods seemed to close in tighter as night fell. I thought I heard something moving out there, a faint rustle, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it was too dark to tell. I tried not to dwell on it. I reminded myself that the whole reason I came here was for the isolation, to be away from people. It was supposed to feel empty. But that first night, when I lay down in the small bed, the silence pressed hard against me. Every creak of the cabin made me pause. I wasn't used to it. At home, there were always cars outside, or neighbors arguing, or music drifting from an apartment window. Here, there was nothing. I drifted off eventually, but my sleep was shallow, full of half-formed dreams and the feeling that someone might be standing just outside the cabin. The routine. By the second day, I started to settle in. I made coffee on the old stove and ate a plain breakfast while looking out over the lake. I walked down to the shoreline and tested the water with my hand. It was colder than I expected, even though the air was sticky and warm. I followed a faint trail through the trees along the lake, branches scratching at my arms as I walked. There were birds, a few squirrels darting across fallen logs, but no people, not even the sound of a distant boat engine. When I came back, I noticed how far the cabin really was from everything. No other houses along the lake, no driveways cutting through the woods. Just this one road that ended at the clearing in front of the cabin. I told myself I liked it, that it was exactly what I paid for, but part of me felt exposed. If anything happened out here, nobody would know. Nobody would hear. The days went slow. I read a paperback I brought. I tried fishing off the small dock. I sat in the shade and swatted away mosquitoes. By evening, I usually poured myself a drink and listened to the frogs calling from the reeds. At night, though, the quiet returned heavier. Sometimes I thought I heard twigs breaking deeper in the woods. Sometimes the cabin walls popped with the temperature drop and made me sit up straight in bed, pulse racing, before I realized it was nothing. On the third night, I woke up with a start around 2 a.m. The room was dark except for a faint rectangle of moonlight on the floor. I had the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. I stayed still, my ears straining. For a long minute, I heard nothing but my own breathing. Then, faintly, something outside, like the crunch of a footstep in gravel. I froze. Came once, then silence. I waited, every muscle tense. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer moving near the porch. But my body didn't believe it. I didn't sleep much after that. When the sun came up, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs. The ground was mostly dirt and pine needles. Near the porch, though, I saw something that made me stop. A boot print. Not mine. I compared it to the soles of my shoes and it didn't match. The tread was deeper, wider. It had rained lightly the previous afternoon, and the edges of the print were sharp, not yet blurred. Whoever it was, they had been there last night. Unease. The discovery sat heavy with me the rest of the day. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe the owner had stopped by to check on the place, or maybe a hiker wandered off the main trail, though I hadn't seen any trailheads for miles. Still, I couldn't ignore the boot print. It meant someone had been close enough to the cabin to stand just outside the porch while I was sleeping inside. That night, I double-checked that the door was locked. I pulled the curtains tight and left a lantern burning in the main room. I lay in bed listening, every small noise magnified in the silence. Around midnight, I thought I heard something again. The faint crunch of movement outside, then a dragging sound like a branch being pulled along the ground. My stomach knotted. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, trying not to make a sound. After a long while, it stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal. It had to be. By morning, there was no sign of anything. No new prints, no broken branches. But when I walked to the dock, I saw something that made me uneasy. A cigarette, but half buried in the dirt near the waterline. I didn't smoke. I hadn't brought anyone here, which meant someone else had stood by the lake recently. Someone close. I had not planned on being alone in the mountains that October, but things rarely worked out the way I thought they would. The trip had been arranged weeks before with a couple of friends, but one by one they backed out: work, family, last-minute excuses. By the time I looked at the small reservation slip for the cabin, I had already paid the fee, and I figured it would be easier just to go by myself than waste the money. Besides, I had been telling myself I needed the solitude. A few days of quiet, away from the noise of the city, away from the constant ringing of my phone, might clear my head. The cabin was in northern Idaho, a 2.5-hour drive from the town where I had rented a car. The road narrowed the further I went, until eventually it was just dirt, twisting sharply through thick forests of pine and aspen. The GPS lost its signal halfway, so I had to rely on an old paper map the rental guy had thrown in the glove box. I remember the air changing as I climbed higher. It smelled colder, sharper, like wet soil and dry needles mixed together. The season was changing fast at that altitude. Patches of yellow leaves clung stubbornly to branches while most had already fallen and were plastered across the forest floor, damp and matted from recent rain. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I sat in the car for a few minutes, just looking at it. The place was smaller than I imagined. Weathered gray logs stacked neatly, a metal roof that had rust streaks running down the sides, and 2 steps leading up to a short porch with a railing that leaned slightly. It didn't look abandoned exactly, but it definitely wasn't a tourist's idea of cozy. The cabin stood in a small clearing, trees pressing in from every side except for a narrow dirt drive that ended right where I parked. There was no one else around. No other cabins, no signs, not even power lines. The silence was the first thing that got under my skin. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. In the city, silence still has hums in it. Traffic far away, someone's dog barking, planes passing overhead. Out here, nothing. The sound of my car engine shutting off left a ringing in my ears. I could hear the tiny noises of myself shifting in the seat, my own breath, the zipper of my jacket as I pulled it tighter. The key was under a loose stone by the steps, just like the booking note had said. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the dry smell of old wood and faint mildew. The place was one big room with a small divider creating a sleeping nook. A narrow bed pushed against the wall, a tiny wood stove with a dented metal pipe leading up through the ceiling, a kitchenette with just enough space for a propane burner, and a table with 2 mismatched chairs. The window glass was wavy and spotted from years of weather. I set my bag down on the table and walked the perimeter, touching things like I had to confirm they were real. The boards creaked under my feet with every step, and when I stood still, the silence closed in again. I busied myself with small tasks to settle in. I stacked the firewood that was piled inside near the stove, filled the metal kettle with water from a jug I brought, and lit one of the lanterns that hung on a hook by the wall. The warm glow spread across the cabin, pushing shadows into the corners. I told myself it was fine. This was exactly what I wanted, no distractions, just a couple of nights of peace. But already there was something about the quiet that pressed on me in a way I didn't expect. My phone had no signal at all, not even one bar, and when I placed it on the table, it looked useless, like dead weight. I could almost hear my brain trying to reach for noise, for something familiar, but finding nothing. I unpacked some food, cans, dried stuff, a loaf of bread, then went outside before it got dark. The air had turned colder since I arrived, and a wind moved through the trees in a low rush that seemed to come from every direction at once. I walked the clearing slowly, crunching leaves under my boots, staring out into the forest edge. The trees were so dense that 10 feet in, it was already dark. My own reflection in the cabin window startled me when I turned back. I realized then how easy it would be to feel like I wasn't really alone, even though I knew I was. By the time night came, I had the stove burning, the cabin warm enough to sit in just a sweatshirt. I ate a can of soup heated on the burner and listened to the fire snap. At first I thought I might read one of the books I had packed, but I kept catching myself listening instead. Listening for anything beyond the walls. And every time I told myself there was nothing to hear, some part of me still waited for a sound. Came sometime after midnight. I had dozed on the bed, the fire low, shadows moving in the corners as the lantern flickered. The sound was faint, at first so faint I thought I dreamed it. A crunch. The slow kind of crunch boots make on leaves or gravel. Then silence. My body stiffened without me telling it to, like every muscle had heard before my brain did. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. Then a long pause. I sat up, the blanket sliding off my legs, my skin prickling. The window was a dim rectangle on the far wall, no moonlight getting through the trees. I reached for the lantern, but stopped with my hand halfway. The thought hit me hard. If someone was out there, the light would show exactly where I was. I stayed frozen, eyes straining in the dark, ears catching every tiny sound. The crunch came again, softer this time, like weight shifting slow. Then nothing. I waited, my heart beating too loud, until the silence stretched so long I thought maybe it had been an animal, or maybe just my head turning the wind into footsteps. After 10 minutes I couldn't take it anymore and forced myself to lie back down, pulling the blanket up, telling myself over and over that it was just the forest, just the wind, just leaves falling. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the cabin, every gust against the roof, I jumped. By morning, my eyes burned from half sleep. I was 32 the year I decided to spend a week alone at the old cabin. It wasn't really mine, but my uncle had bought it decades earlier, and after he passed, it just sat there, unused. It was one of those wooden places people build as weekend getaways, but over time the paint peels, the roof sags a little, and the road leading to it grows more forgotten each year. I'd been working long hours in the city, and I told myself a week in the quiet woods would reset my head. I thought I needed silence. I thought I needed to escape. The cabin sat deep in the northern woods of Montana, at least 30 miles from the nearest small town. The drive out there was long, about an hour and a half from town, then another 30 minutes of rough dirt roads. My uncle used to call it the kind of place where you could scream and nobody would hear you. I used to think that was a joke. Driving up there alone in my beat-up SUV, I realized it wasn't. It was late September, the kind of season when the days are warm but the nights bite down cold. The trees were already turning. Every mile deeper into the woods, I felt more and more alone. I passed no cars, saw no cabins, no hikers, nothing. Just trees swallowing the road and the crunch of my tires over dirt and rock. When I reached the cabin, I parked in the small clearing out front. The cabin looked even more run down than I remembered. It was a squat, single-story building with a tin roof, a small porch with half-broken steps, and shutters that barely clung to the sides. The place had always been primitive. No running water, no real electricity except a generator my uncle had left behind. Inside, there was a fireplace, a couple of small bedrooms, a kitchen with an old propane stove, and a bathroom that never worked. I unloaded my supplies. A week's worth of canned food, a case of bottled water, a flashlight, batteries, firewood, a sleeping bag, a hunting knife, and an old .22 rifle my father insisted I bring, just in case. I didn't plan on hunting. The rifle was more of a comfort item than anything else. The first evening was uneventful. I lit a fire, heated a can of soup, and sat outside on the porch as the sun set behind the trees. The air was crisp and quiet. Too quiet. Even in the woods near town, you hear things. Cars in the distance, planes overhead, dogs barking. Out here, there was nothing but wind and the occasional snap of a branch. When the sun finally disappeared, the darkness swallowed everything whole. I'd forgotten how dark it could get without streetlights or house lights, just pure black pressing in from every direction. I sat there for a while, listening. I thought I heard something moving in the brush, but I told myself it was deer. It had to be. I went inside, locked the door out of habit, and lay down in the creaky bed. Sleep didn't come easy. The wood popped as it cooled. The wind rattled the shutters, and every sound felt louder than it should. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, crunching steps. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, listening. After a while, the sound faded. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Maybe. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was covered in leaves, pine needles, and dirt. I walked the perimeter, scanning for tracks. I found nothing clear, just scattered impressions that could have been anything. My rational brain said deer or raccoon. My gut said different. I tried to brush it off. I spent the day chopping wood, organizing supplies, and exploring the woods nearby. The forest was thick, and after only a few minutes of walking, I couldn't see the cabin anymore. I made a note not to go far without marking trees. By late afternoon, I returned. The cabin felt smaller now, almost fragile. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I cooked another simple dinner, sat on the porch again, and listened. When the sun went down, the forest seemed to wake up. I heard rustling, faint cracks of branches, sometimes closer than I liked. My nerves buzzed, but I forced myself to stay put until the stars came out. Then I retreated inside, locked the door, and double-checked the rifle. That night, the noises came again. Not just footsteps this time. I swore I heard breathing outside the window. Heavy, controlled, human. My heart hammered so loud I was afraid it would give me away. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the dark ceiling. The breathing lasted maybe a minute, then faded. The next morning, I checked again. This time I found prints. Not boots, not clear enough for that, but the shape was too large, too flat to be an animal. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there. I told myself I'd leave the next day. I didn't want to look paranoid. I'd drive back to town in the morning and call the week off. One more night, I thought. Just one more. That was a mistake. The day dragged. Every sound in the woods put me on edge. I carried the rifle everywhere, even when I went to the outhouse. My hands shook when I lit the fire that night. I ate without tasting. My ears strained at every rustle. The sky darkened, and I sat in the chair by the window, staring into the trees. It was around midnight when I heard the porch creak. The unmistakable sound of weight shifting on old wood. My throat closed. I gripped the rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Another creak, then another. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The doorknob rattled. Slow at first, then harder. The door held, but the sound made my blood run cold. After what felt like hours, the rattling stopped. Silence. Then footsteps moving away. I stayed frozen until dawn. When light finally seeped through the curtains, I forced myself outside. The dirt in front of the porch was disturbed. Fresh prints, the shape of shoes this time, clear as day. Someone had tried to get in. I didn't wait. I packed everything into the SUV as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I dropped cans and had to chase them. I kept scanning the trees, sure someone was watching. When I finally climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I nearly cried with relief. The drive out felt endless. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure. Every bump in the road felt like something trying to stop me. When I finally hit pavement again, I didn't slow down until I was back in town. I went straight to the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy to check the cabin. A few days later, he told me they found more tracks. Multiple sets. At least 2 people, maybe 3, had been circling the cabin at night. Watching, waiting. They never caught them. I never went back. To this day, I don't know what they wanted. Robbery? Worse? All I know is that the silence I thought I needed nearly swallowed me whole. And sometimes, late at night, when the city grows quiet, I still hear that slow creak of the porch and I see the knob turning. And I remind myself silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's a warning. I never liked telling this story out loud. Even writing it now feels strange, but I know it has stayed in my mind for so many years that it almost feels worse to keep it only in my head. What happened was real, nothing made up, nothing that can be blamed on ghosts or myths. Just the kind of danger that happens when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, away from the safety of crowds, far from anyone who could help you. It was the fall of 2009. I was 26 back then, living in Colorado, working long weeks at a warehouse in Denver. My schedule was always rough, long hours with little sleep, and the noise of forklifts and trucks never left my head even when I got home. I wanted a break badly. I didn't have much money, but a coworker told me about a small rental cabin near Clear Ridge, about 3 hours west of Denver, deep in the mountains. He said he stayed there once with his family, quiet, cheap, no phone signal, and perfect if I wanted to get away for a while. The idea of being disconnected sounded good at first. No calls, no internet, no work reminders. Just quiet. I told myself it would be just a weekend, 2 nights at most. Enough to breathe fresh air, maybe do a little hiking, cook simple meals, and just sit still for once. I packed light. A duffel bag with clothes, a few canned goods, a flashlight, a pocket knife I always carried, and a paperback novel I never managed to finish. I left Denver late on a Friday morning, filled my car with gas, and started driving toward the mountains. The first 2 hours felt good. The highway long and wide, the sky clear with streaks of white clouds stretched thin. The air grew colder the higher I drove. By the time I left the main highway and started onto narrower mountain roads, the leaves had already started to turn. Yellows and oranges glowed against the dark green of pine. For a while I felt calm. I remember thinking how nice it was to leave everything behind, even if just for a couple of days. The directions my coworker gave me were handwritten, not very clear. I had to slow down a few times to check the small road signs. The roads twisted, climbing higher into the ridge. After another 30 minutes, I found the dirt road I was supposed to take. It was rough, scattered with rocks, and I had to go slow so my old car wouldn't rattle itself apart. The trees closed in on both sides, blocking most of the light. Finally, after about 10 minutes, the trees opened up into a clearing. The cabin sat there, small, square, made of old wood darkened by weather. It had one small porch, a narrow chimney, and a single door with a padlock that had already been left open for me. There was no other house in sight, no neighbors, just forest and the dirt road that disappeared behind me. I parked near the porch and sat for a while in the car before getting out. The silence was heavy, the kind you don't notice until you're inside it. No cars, no city hum, not even wind at that moment, just quiet. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots, and carried my bag up to the porch. The wood creaked under my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. There was one main room with a small wood stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A single window faced the trees. To the side, A door led to a tiny bathroom with a rusty sink and a toilet that flushed weakly. The tap water was cold and tasted like metal, but it worked. It wasn't much, but I told myself it was only for 2 nights. I unpacked a little, stacked the canned food on the table, and laid my flashlight and knife beside them. My phone had no signal as expected, so I turned it off to save battery in case I needed the light later. The first hours passed slowly. I walked around the clearing, stretched my legs, and listened to the forest sounds. Squirrels darted up trees. A woodpecker tapped somewhere in the distance. The air smelled sharp and clean. As evening came, I boiled some water on the stove, ate a can of soup, and read a little from my book. I remember feeling restless, not used to so much quiet. Every sound stood out. The crack of branches, the scrape of wood as the cabin shifted. That first night, I slept lightly. I woke often, listening to the forest outside. At one point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel near the porch. Slow, crunching steps. I froze, listening hard. They stopped after a moment, and the silence pressed down again. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer wandering through. Still, I had trouble falling back asleep. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I made coffee on the stove, ate some bread I'd packed, and went for a walk down the dirt road. The sun was bright through the trees, but the road seemed longer than I expected. I walked for about an hour and saw no one, no other cabins, no cars. When I turned back, I noticed something that bothered me. There were boot prints in the dirt, not mine, going in the same direction I had walked earlier. They looked fresh, pressed deep like someone had walked there recently. Back at the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't seen anyone on the road. The prints weren't from me. I checked my own boots, and the tread pattern was different. These had a straight line across the sole, maybe work boots. Someone else had been walking there. That night, I built a small fire in the stove, kept the flashlight close, and tried to sleep again. I woke around midnight to the sound of gravel crunching again. This time, I was sure it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My chest tightened. I didn't move, just lay still on the bed, gripping the handle of my pocket knife under the blanket. The steps stopped near the porch. For what felt like an hour, I heard nothing. Then a faint creak, the wood of the porch shifting under weight. Someone was standing there. I didn't breathe. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. No knock, no attempt at the door, just silence. Eventually, after a long time, I heard the steps again, moving away into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn, my muscles tense, my throat dry. The next morning, I stepped outside carefully. The dirt near the porch had clear boot prints. Large, heavy, pressed deep. Not mine. I wanted to leave right then, but the thought of driving that long dirt road back in a rush made me hesitate. I convinced myself it was maybe a hunter or someone passing by. Maybe they just walked through at night for some reason. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. That day dragged. I kept looking out the window, listening for sounds. Every crack in the forest made me jump. By evening, I had already packed my bag and set it by the door. I ate nothing but a granola bar, too on edge to cook. When night came, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the table, flashlight in hand, knife on the wood beside me. Hours crawled by. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. The crunch of gravel. This time slower, heavier. My skin crawled. The steps reached the porch. Then, for the first time, the doorknob rattled. A slow twist back and forth like someone testing it. The door held. I sat frozen, heart hammering, gripping the knife so hard my hand shook. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. I thought about shouting, but the idea of letting whoever it was know I was awake made me stay quiet. Minutes passed. Then, from the window, came a faint scraping sound, like fingers dragging on glass. Couldn't take it. I grabbed my bag, stuffed the flashlight in my pocket, and slipped out the back window. The night air was freezing, my breath white in the beam of the moon. I crouched low, listening. The front porch creaked again. Whoever it was, they were still there. I ran, not down the road, but straight into the trees. Branches tore at my jacket, the ground uneven under my boots. I kept running until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would snap. Only then did I stop, crouching behind a fallen log, trying not to make a sound. I don't know how long I stayed there. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The forest was dark, but every so often I thought I heard movement, faint cracks of branches not far away. I couldn't be sure if it was real or my mind breaking under fear. When the sky finally began to pale, I forced myself back to the road. My car was still there, untouched. The cabin sat quiet, the door still closed. But in the dirt, fresh boot prints circled the house again and again, dozens of times, like someone had walked around it for hours. I didn't wait. I started the car, tires spitting gravel, and drove without stopping until I reached the highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I never told the owner what happened. I never told my coworker either. For weeks after, I kept waking at night to sounds that weren't there, listening for footsteps outside my apartment. It's been years now, but I still remember the weight of that silence, the sound of boots on gravel, the knob rattling in the dark. I know this much. Someone was out there, not a ghost, not an animal, person, watching, waiting, and I will never go back to Clear Ridge again. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in the woods. It was early October of 2016, and I had been working in a noisy city job for years, always surrounded by people, traffic, and the constant hum of things that made my head heavy. A friend of mine mentioned an old rental cabin near the foothills of northern Idaho, hidden down an unmarked dirt road. The pictures online looked quiet, plain, nothing fancy, just a wooden structure surrounded by pine trees and a little clearing with a fire pit. That was enough for me. The drive took nearly 8 hours. By the time I turned off the paved road and followed the gravel path through miles of forest, the sun was already dipping behind the tree line. My phone had lost service miles earlier, and the GPS froze on a blank map. All I had was a printed set of directions and the growing sound of rocks crunching under my tires. I remember thinking how quiet it was the deeper I drove. No houses, no cars, no power lines. Just walls of trees and the occasional glimpse of a deer darting into the brush. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked even smaller than it had in the photos. A simple rectangle, weather-worn wood, a tin roof, one porch light that I wasn't sure even worked. The clearing around it was uneven, with weeds curling up against the steps. I cut the engine, and the silence after the car stopped felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in a city apartment at night. It was thick, pressing, as if the trees themselves swallowed sound. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen counter with an old propane burner, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a door leading to a cramped bathroom. There was no power, no running water. A stack of wood sat in a bin by the stove, and a metal lantern hung on a nail near the door. It smelled like dust and pine sap. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, lit the lantern, and heated a can of soup on the burner. I sat by the small window, staring at nothing, trying to get used to how black the woods were once the light disappeared. Back home, even the darkest streets always had some glow, street lamps, neon signs, headlights. Here, the darkness was absolute, pressed against the glass so hard it felt alive. I barely slept that night, half listening to the creaks of the cabin and the occasional snap of a branch outside. By the second day, I settled into a routine. I collected wood, walked short distances down the dirt road, and sat outside in the clearing. I told myself I came out there to reset, to think, to breathe. But the more time I spent outside, the more I noticed how easy it was to feel watched. The trees never ended. Every direction was the same. Endless trunks, endless shadows. Even when nothing was moving, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder as if someone stood just beyond the tree line. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time. A sound outside, not an animal shuffling, not a branch falling. It was deliberate. Slow, heavy steps in the dirt just beyond the porch. They didn't last long, maybe 5 or 6, and then silence again. I stayed frozen under the blanket, every muscle tight. I waited for more, but nothing came. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, half convinced I had imagined it. Near the porch, I found marks in the dirt. They weren't shoe prints exactly, just indentations, as if someone had stood there for a while. The ground was hard, packed with pine needles, so it was difficult to tell. I told myself it could have been me unloading the car the night I arrived. I pushed the thought aside, though it stuck in the back of my mind like a splinter. Day 3 passed slowly. I hiked a little, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more uneasy I felt. I couldn't shake the thought of those steps. I kept glancing back down the path, expecting to see someone behind me, even though no one was there. By evening, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I built a small fire outside and sat near it until the cold pushed me back in. That night, I barely slept again. Around midnight, I heard the steps return. This time they moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Slow, steady, measured. Gravel and twigs crunching under weight. Then nothing. I held my breath for what felt like hours, staring at the dark ceiling, my ears straining for every shift in sound. Eventually, I dozed off, but my dreams were restless, full of shadows and muffled movement. The next morning, I found something different. Near the back wall of the cabin, there was a small mark in the dirt. A cigarette butt. Old, yellowed filter, faint smell of tobacco. I hadn't smoked in years. I hadn't even brought cigarettes with me. I felt a cold wave crawl through me as I stared at it. Someone had been there, close enough to stand at the wall, close enough to drop that. I walked the clearing in slow circles, scanning the ground, the trees, the road leading in. Nothing else, just the cigarette. I pocketed it without really knowing why. That entire day, I couldn't relax. Every sound seemed sharper. The wind in the branches, the caw of distant birds, the crack of twigs under squirrels. I kept expecting footsteps, kept expecting a figure to appear at the tree line. I considered leaving, but the idea of packing up and driving that long dirt road at night felt worse. I told myself I could make it to the weekend. Just a few more days. That night was worse. The steps returned, circling this time. Slow crunches moving around the cabin, pausing, then moving again. My mouth went dry. I clutched the flashlight in bed, pointing it at the door, my heart hammering. The wood stove had burned low, and the silence between steps was so sharp I could hear my own breathing. I didn't move until morning. When daylight finally came, I checked again. This time I found more. Near the side of the cabin, faint impressions in the dirt. Clearer now. Boots. Someone had walked circles around the place. My stomach twisted. I wanted to leave right then. I started packing, but halfway through, I stopped. Something about rushing onto that road felt wrong. Whoever it was, they could be out there, waiting. The cabin, for all its flaws, had walls, a lock, some shelter. The road was open, exposed. I convinced myself to stay one more night, but to stay awake, to watch. That evening, I built a fire again, bigger this time, hoping the light might keep whoever it was away. I sat with my back to the cabin, staring at the tree line until my eyes watered. The woods stayed quiet, too quiet. As the fire died, I went back inside and set the lantern near the door. I kept the flashlight in one hand, a kitchen knife in the other, and sat against the wall by the window, listening. Hours dragged. At some point past midnight, I heard it again. Not steps this time, but the soft scrape of something against the wood siding. Slow, deliberate, just inches from where I sat. My skin crawled. I raised the flashlight, hand trembling, but didn't dare shine it out the window. The scraping stopped, then silence. I don't know how long I stayed frozen there. When I finally blinked, the lantern had burned low, and faint gray light was seeping in through the window. Morning. I hadn't slept at all. I checked outside. No new footprints. No sign of scraping on the wall. Just the same still woods, the same endless trees. I stood there for a long time, gripping the knife, trying to decide what to do. By then, my food was running low. I had planned for a week, but my nerves were shot, and I hadn't been eating much. I decided that morning I would leave. Whatever waited out there on the road, It couldn't be worse than another night in the cabin. I loaded the car quickly, eyes darting to the woods every few seconds. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, I felt a rush of relief, as if just being behind the wheel gave me power again. I started the engine, gravel spitting under the tires as I turned onto the dirt road. Half a mile down, I saw it. In the middle of the road, just ahead of a bend, was a fresh pile of branches, stacked deliberately across the path. Not fallen, stacked. My chest tightened. Someone had blocked the way. I stopped a good 20 feet from it, staring. The branches weren't huge, thin pine limbs maybe 3 or 4 feet long, but there were dozens of them layered thick across the road. Enough to slow a car, maybe puncture a tire. I sat there, engine idling, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The woods looked the same as always, but the silence felt loaded, waiting. After a long minute, I threw the car in reverse, hard hammering, and backed all the way down the road to the clearing. Couldn't go forward. Not like that. Back at the cabin, I killed the engine and sat gripping the wheel, sweat running down my face despite the cold. Whoever it was, they didn't just watch. They wanted me stuck. They wanted me there. I didn't unpack. I didn't go back inside. I sat in the car the rest of the day, watching the tree line, jumping at every flicker of shadow. The sun dropped, and with it came the darkness again. That night, I didn't plan on staying out there for more than a week. The whole idea was supposed to be simple. Drive up north, get away from noise, breathe in cold air that hadn't been recycled through a city full of cars, and spend some time alone. I rented the cabin through an online listing. It was small, a single room with a loft, a little porch, and a narrow gravel road that cut through pine trees before opening to a clearing where it sat like something forgotten. The photos looked normal enough, plain wood siding, a pitched roof, and a rusted chimney pipe jutting out like a crooked finger. It was early October of 2015, and the leaves had already started changing, so the drive up was at least beautiful. I was 31 then, single, and burned out from the office job that had been slowly wearing me down for years. I thought isolation would clear my head. I brought a couple of paperbacks, a bag of groceries, a cheap hatchet, and a small cooler filled with beer. I remember telling myself I didn't want to rely on my phone except for emergencies. The plan was no internet, no television, no distractions. Just woods, a quiet cabin, and maybe a notebook if I felt like writing something down. When I first pulled in, I noticed how silent everything felt. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get at night in a suburban neighborhood where you still hear cars in the distance or dogs barking. It was absolute. I cut the engine, stepped out, and the silence pressed in on me like weight. The cabin was older than the photos showed. The boards were gray and weathered, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. The porch steps wobbled under my boots. Still, it wasn't falling apart, and it had electricity, running water, and even a wood stove. Inside, the place smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The air was cold. I remember setting my bag down and looking around slowly, almost like I was entering someone else's home instead of a rental. The floorboards creaked with every step, and there were spider webs stretched across the corners near the ceiling. The windows were streaked with dirt. The bed in the loft had a thin blanket and one flat pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do. That first day, I walked a little into the woods behind the cabin just to get my bearings. The trees were close together, their trunks dark and damp with patches of moss. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles and rotting leaves. The further I walked, the more I realized how easy it would be to get lost out there. Everything looked the same in every direction, and the canopy blocked out most of the sky. After maybe 15 minutes, I turned back, making sure to keep the sound of gravel crunching under my boots as a reference until the cabin came back into view. That night was when I realized how different it felt to be out there alone. As soon as the sun dropped, the forest went black. Not dim, not shadowed, black. The windows were useless after that point. I lit one of the old lamps inside, and it gave off a weak yellow glow that barely pushed back the darkness. I tried to read, but every time the cabin creaked or a gust of wind rattled the siding, I'd look up, The silence wasn't so calming anymore. It was heavy, like the trees and the dark outside were waiting. I didn't sleep well. Every sound woke me. The tick of wood contracting in the walls, the scurry of something small in the rafters, the faint whistle of wind through gaps I hadn't noticed before. At one point, I could have sworn I heard something crunch across the gravel outside. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering, staring down through the loft at the front door. But it never opened. I told myself it had to be an animal and eventually lay back down, though my eyes stayed open until dawn. The second day, I tried to settle in. I chopped some firewood, though the logs were damp and smoked more than they burned. I walked a little further along the gravel road, just to see where it went. It twisted deeper into the woods until I lost sight of the cabin. At some point, it branched left, but I didn't follow it. Something about being too far from the cabin unsettled me, so I turned around. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon sitting on the porch, writing a few notes about the silence, about how strange it felt to be cut off. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something knocking. Not loud, just a dull thump against the wall. Came once, then silence. I froze in bed, listening. A few minutes later, it came again, closer to the door. My body went rigid, and I held my breath. I waited, staring into the dark. After what felt like an hour, nothing else happened. But I didn't sleep again. By the third day, I was exhausted. I told myself I was being stupid, that every old cabin in the woods probably made noises like that animals bumped against the walls sometimes, raccoons or deer rubbing past. I tried to ignore it. I cooked eggs, read a few chapters of the book I brought, and pretended not to notice how the woods seemed to get quieter the longer I stayed. Birds that I'd heard on the first day weren't calling anymore. Even the wind seemed to have gone still. That afternoon, I noticed something on the side of the cabin I hadn't seen before. Scratches in the wood near one of the windows. They weren't deep, but they were long, parallel, and fresh. I ran my fingers over them. It didn't look like claw marks. They were too straight, more like someone had dragged a knife lightly along the wall. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I'd been leaving it unlocked before. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. My ears strained for noises. My eyes kept flicking toward the windows. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. That night was the worst yet. I lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling, when I heard footsteps. Not an animal. Real footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, steady, crunching closer. I sat up, my throat dry. They stopped just short of the porch. The silence after was worse than the sound itself. Whoever it was, or whatever, stood out there, not moving. I could almost feel the presence of it through the wall. Minutes dragged by. Then the footsteps started again, circling the cabin. My chest felt tight. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loud. When the steps finally faded into the woods, I stayed sitting upright until the sun came up. My muscles ached, and my head throbbed. I decided I couldn't stay another night. It wasn't animals. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there. Someone who knew I was alone. I started packing as soon as the light came through the trees. I shoved my clothes into the bag, stuffed the books away, dumped the cooler. When I stepped outside to load the car, I froze. The gravel in front of the cabin had fresh footprints. Bare footprints. Large. They led from the tree line to the porch and then back into the woods. I didn't waste another second. I slammed my bag into the back seat, jumped into the driver's side, and turned the key. The engine struggled for a moment, then caught. I yanked the wheel hard, gravel spitting out behind the tires as I pushed the car down the narrow road. Every turn felt too long. Every tree felt like it was leaning in closer. When I passed the branch in the road I'd seen earlier, I noticed something I hadn't before. Tire tracks leading down it, fresher than mine. I didn't stop to think. I drove until the trees thinned, until the gravel gave way to cracked pavement, until cell service finally returned and my phone lit up. My hands were still shaking on the wheel when I pulled into the first gas station I saw. I sat there for a long time, staring at my pale face in the rearview mirror, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That someone scratched the walls and left footprints in the gravel? No one would believe it, or they'd shrug it off as trespassers. But I know what I felt in that cabin. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watched. And every night since, when I wake up at 3 in the morning for no reason at all, I can still hear those footsteps circling slowly in my head, reminding me how close they came. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was late in the fall of 1998. The air heavy with the smell of damp leaves and smoke from chimneys in the small town I had driven through to get here. The cabin wasn't mine, not originally. It belonged to a man named Douglas, a coworker of mine who had inherited it from his uncle and rarely used it. He mentioned it one afternoon while we were both leaving the office, saying it was too far from the city for him to bother with, but that it was a quiet place if someone ever needed to get away. I didn't think much of it then, but when the noise of the city started grinding me down and the thought of isolation felt less like loneliness and more like relief, I asked him if I could borrow it. He shrugged and handed me a key. The drive up took nearly 6 hours. I remember the endless curves of the road cutting through dense forest, the sun already low, the temperature dropping as I climbed higher into the hills. The cabin sat about a mile off a gravel road, tucked away where the trees grew so thick it looked as if they were trying to close in on it. There was no cell signal, no neighbors within shouting distance, just the creak of trees in the wind and the sharp cries of crows cutting across the silence. When I parked, the headlights caught the side of the cabin, showing the faded red paint peeling from the logs, the front porch sagging under years of weight and weather. The windows were dark. The place looked abandoned, but when I stepped onto the porch and unlocked the door, the hinges groaned and the smell of old wood and dust rolled out, heavy but not unbearable. Inside, everything was basic. A wood stove sat in the corner, a pile of chopped logs stacked neatly against the wall. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a single bed against the far wall, and shelves stocked with canned goods so old the labels were faded. The first night, I lit the stove, heated a can of soup, and ate in silence. I sat at the table staring at the wood grain while the fire cracked, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But peace in a place like that doesn't last. The second day I explored. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly, a sea of dark trunks and undergrowth. The air was colder in the shade, damp, carrying the smell of pine and earth. I followed a trail that ran behind the cabin, a narrow path packed down hard by deer or maybe hunters years ago. It wound deeper and deeper until the cabin disappeared completely from sight. I walked for nearly an hour, listening to the silence broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out in the woods. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing with an old, rusted fire ring in the middle, half buried in leaves. Someone had camped there once, long ago, but it felt forgotten now. I turned back, but something about the forest unsettled me. It wasn't the usual unease of being alone in the woods. I had been camping before, slept in tents where bears roamed nearby, but this was different. The silence felt heavy, unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Every time I stopped walking, I thought I heard something just out of reach. A faint crack, a whisper of movement, but always gone when I turned my head. When I finally saw the cabin again through the trees, I felt a small rush of relief. I hadn't realized how tense my shoulders were until I stepped back inside and dropped my bag on the table. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low, and though the cabin was warm, I kept waking up. My eyes would open to the faint glow of embers through the stove's grate, and I'd lie still, listening. I told myself it was just the woods, branches shifting in the wind, animals moving in the underbrush, but the sound seemed closer, like something was brushing against the walls of the cabin itself. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was imagining it. The third day, I tried to shake it off. I went out again, this time following the gravel road instead of the trail. It stretched straight for a while, then bent out of sight, disappearing into the trees. The air was colder, the wind sharper. My breath fogged in front of me. After a mile or so, I came across something odd. A set of tire tracks in the dirt, faint but fresh enough that the edges hadn't yet been blurred by rain or wind. They were narrow, like they belonged to an old truck. I crouched down, studying them. The strange thing was, I hadn't seen any other cabins or homes in that area. The gravel road itself seemed abandoned, with weeds growing through the cracks. So why would there be fresh tire marks leading deeper into nowhere? I followed them for a while, maybe another half-mile, until the trees thickened again and the tracks veered off into a side path I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't much of a road, just two ruts cutting into the dirt, leading somewhere unseen. I thought about following it but decided against it. The light was fading, and I didn't want to risk getting turned around in the woods at night. When I got back to the cabin, the unease was worse than before. I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks, about who else might be out here. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't done it the first 2 nights. It hadn't even crossed my mind. But now, as the wind pressed against the windows and the trees moaned outside, I slid the bolt firmly into place. And then I heard it. It started as a faint crunch outside, like footsteps moving slowly through the leaves. I froze, listening, my hand hovering over the stove poker beside the bed. The sound circled the cabin, pausing every so often, as if whoever it was stopped to listen, too. My chest tightened. I held my breath. Minutes passed. The sound faded. Eventually, I let myself relax, telling myself again it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, nothing else. But when I woke the next morning and stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, just a few feet from the porch. Not animal tracks. Boots. Large, heavy boots that had circled the cabin and stopped directly in front of the door. I wasn't planning on spending the summer in that cabin. It wasn't even mine. My uncle had left it to me after he passed away the year before, but I hadn't stepped foot in it until July of 1997. He never married, never had kids, and the cabin was just one of those things that came with his name. I had always thought of it as some old wooden box in the middle of nowhere, more trouble than it was worth. But that year, I wanted to be away from people. I was 28, burned out, and tired of the city. I had a job that paid the bills but left me drained every night. My girlfriend had just left me, saying she couldn't handle my moods anymore. I didn't blame her. I was quiet, withdrawn, and maybe too cold. I thought maybe a couple of weeks alone in the woods might clear my head. The cabin sat in a narrow valley in northern Idaho, near the Clearwater River. The road to it was barely a road, more like a trail cut out by logging trucks 30 years ago. By the time I got there in my beat-up Ford Ranger, I had already scraped the undercarriage twice. The air smelled of pine and dust, the sun bouncing off the dry dirt, and when I finally saw the roof of the cabin through the trees, I felt something I hadn't in months. Relief. The place looked better than I expected. The wood was old but not rotting, the front porch tilted but still holding. 2 windows in front, shutters missing on one side. The door stuck when I tried to open it, and I had to shoulder it to get in. Inside, it smelled like dust, old paper, and faintly of tobacco. My uncle had been a heavy smoker, and the smell clung to the walls like it was part of the wood itself. There were 2 rooms. The main room with a wood stove, a small table, and a single bed pushed against the wall, and then a back room that looked like it had once been used for storage. There was no electricity, no running water. I knew that from the start, and I'd brought supplies. Bottled water, canned food, a lantern, a hatchet, and a shotgun my dad insisted I take. The first night was calm. Too calm. The woods around the valley went dead quiet once the sun dropped. No traffic noise, no hum of power lines, no neighbors. Just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of branches. I lay on the thin mattress staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Every small creak of the wood sounded like something moving. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to it. On the second day, I started exploring. Behind the cabin, the land sloped up into a thick wall of forest. I followed a deer trail up the ridge, sweating under the July sun, until I reached a spot where I could see the entire valley. The cabin was small below me, almost swallowed by trees. Beyond that, just endless green rolling hills. I didn't see another house or road. That should have felt peaceful, but it gave me a strange kind of unease. Back at the cabin, I chopped some wood and stacked it. I cleaned the place a little, sweeping out mouse droppings and dead leaves that had blown in through the cracks. I tried to settle in. It was the third night when things started to feel wrong. I woke up at maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, not sure why. The lantern had burned out hours earlier, and the only light was a pale line of moon through the window. I stayed still for a while, listening. Then I heard it, a faint sound outside. Not an animal, more like steps, slow, uneven, in the dirt just beyond the porch. Crunch, pause, crunch. I held my breath. The shotgun was by the bed, leaning against the wall, but I didn't reach for it. I just lay there, frozen. The steps went from one side of the cabin to the other. Then silence. I told myself it could have been a deer, an elk, anything. But the way it had moved, it had sounded deliberate. The next morning, I went outside. The dirt around the cabin was dry and hard, but near the porch I found marks. They weren't boots. They weren't hooves. Bare feet. Long, narrow, with the heel and toes pressed deep, like whoever it was had been standing there a while. I stared at them for a long time. They were adult-sized, too big to be a kid. The cabin was miles from the nearest house, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. I didn't know what to do with that. I walked the tree line, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. I thought maybe someone had been camping or hiking, or maybe some drifter had wandered through. But bare feet, in the middle of sharp pine needles and rocks? That day I kept busy. I hauled more wood, checked the river, tried to fish. I told myself I was imagining things, or that maybe the tracks were old and I just noticed them. By evening, I almost convinced myself. But that night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, just lying in the dark with the shotgun across my lap. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of steps again. Slow, circling. I held my breath, heart pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The steps came closer, right up to the wall of the cabin. Then a long pause. Wood creaked. The porch. Someone was standing on it. The door rattled softly, like a hand on the handle. Not pushing hard, just testing. I aimed the shotgun at the door, my finger trembling on the trigger. I didn't call out, didn't move, just waited. The handle stopped moving. Then silence. Minutes dragged. My arms ached from holding the gun steady. Finally, I heard the steps again, moving away, slowly. I sat there until dawn, wide-eyed, ears straining for any sound. When the sun rose, I opened the door and stepped out. The dirt was marked again. Fresh bare footprints circling the cabin, clear as day. Something about it broke me a little. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. Someone had been out there watching me, testing the door. I didn't leave right then, though. That's the part one regret. I thought maybe if I stayed inside during the nights, if I made noise, if I showed I was armed, they'd leave me alone. I told myself it was probably some crazy hermit, some harmless lunatic from the woods. But deep down, I knew better. On the 5th night, things got worse. Started the same. Footsteps, circling, the porch creaking. But this time, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, steady breaths, just on the other side of the wall from where I sat. I gripped the shotgun so tight my knuckles ached. I wanted to shout, to fire through the wall, to do anything, but I couldn't move. My body was locked up. I sat there listening to whoever it was standing just inches away, their breath filling the silence. Then suddenly the breathing stopped. I waited. 1 minute, 5, 10, nothing. But when I finally built up the courage to look out the window, I saw it. In the moonlight, halfway between the cabin and the tree line, someone was standing, not moving, just staring. I dropped back below the window, shaking. When I looked again, they were gone. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed everything I could into the truck, heart racing the whole time. The woods felt different now, heavy, watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out between the trees. When I turned the key in the ignition, The engine coughed once, then died. I tried again. Nothing, just a grinding noise. I popped the hood, hands shaking, and stared at the engine. I didn't know much about cars, but I could see it plain as day. The wires had been cut, clean through. Someone had done it while I slept. I don't remember the next few hours clearly. I know I slammed the hood down and grabbed the shotgun. I know I stuffed a backpack with food and water. My plan was to hike out, follow the logging road until I reached somewhere with people. But every step down that dirt road felt like a trap. The trees pressed in on both sides, and I kept thinking of the bare footprints circling me in the night. I walked for miles. The sun was burning down, sweat stinging my eyes, my legs aching. But I didn't see anyone, didn't hear a car, just birds and insects, normal sounds that felt out of place after the nights of silence. By late afternoon, I turned a bend in the road and stopped cold. There, in the dust ahead of me, were more footprints, bare feet, fresh, leading away from me, deeper into the woods. I froze, staring. Then I realized something worse. There weren't just one set, there were two. I turned and started walking faster. My backpack bounced, the shotgun heavy in my hands. I didn't run, not yet. I didn't want to look like prey. But as the shadows grew longer and the forest darkened, I knew I wasn't making it out before nightfall. I had to choose. Keep going on the road, or cut into the woods and hide until morning. I chose the woods. I pushed through branches and undergrowth until I found a spot beneath a fallen pine, half hollow underneath. I crawled in, clutching the shotgun, trying to make myself small. The forest went dark around me. For hours, I didn't move. Every sound made me flinch. I tried not to breathe too loud. My legs cramped, my neck ached, but I stayed curled up, waiting for dawn. At some point in the night, I heard it again. Steps, crunch. I never planned on spending that much time alone, but in late September of 1996, I found myself driving deep into the hills of northern Montana with a single key in my pocket and a duffel bag in the back seat of my car. My uncle had a cabin up there that he hadn't used in years, and after months of working without a break and feeling myself grind down into exhaustion, he suggested I take a week away. No phones, no work, no one around, just me and quiet. I was 27 at the time, still figuring out who I was supposed to be, and I thought the idea of complete silence in the woods might clear my head. My uncle's directions were vague. He hadn't been there himself since the late 80s. The last time he stayed, he said, the roof leaked and the wood stove needed patching. But he swore it was still standing and that I'd find it locked but ready. The drive up took most of the day. The road thinned out the further I went, first paved, then gravel, then dirt. By the time I turned onto the final track that wound through thick pine trees, the sun was low and the temperature had dropped. There were no street signs, just faded markers nailed to trunks and a couple of rusted mailboxes at the last fork. I followed his written notes carefully, counting turns, mile markers, landmarks. When I reached the cabin, the clearing surprised me. The trees broke suddenly, and there it was. A squat two-room structure with dark, weather-worn boards, a sagging tin roof, and a front porch with one rail missing. It looked forgotten. The clearing around it was uneven, dotted with weeds and tufts of grass. The air smelled heavy, damp, as if the place held moisture in its bones. I parked beside it and sat in the car for a few minutes. The forest was loud with crickets and distant rustling, but otherwise there was nothing. No houses nearby, no trails, no signs of life. Just the cabin and the trees pressing in. I finally got out and tested the key in the door. Turned stiffly, but it worked. Inside was exactly as I expected. Dust on the floorboards, cobwebs stretched across corners, old wooden furniture pushed against the walls. The air was stale. A table stood in the center with two chairs. A small kitchen with a pump sink and rust-stained counter sat against the back wall. A wood stove crouched near the far corner, its pipe disappearing into the ceiling. The bedroom was barely large enough for a bed frame and a narrow dresser. A window looked out onto the trees. I checked it, then checked the others, making sure they were shut and latched. Old habits. I never liked the idea of being out in the middle of nowhere with things unsecured. That first night was rough. Couldn't settle. Every noise seemed amplified. The creak of the wood as it cooled, the scratching of something small in the walls, the distant cracking of branches in the woods. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for hours, trying to remind myself that it was normal. Animals, wind, wood shifting, nothing more. Eventually, exhaustion took me. The mornings were better. Sunlight filled the clearing and cut away the unease. I made coffee on a little camp stove I'd brought and sat on the porch listening to the birds. By midday, the woods felt almost friendly. I explored some of the trails nearby, checked the old shed behind the cabin, and stacked wood for the stove. For a while, it almost felt like the retreat I'd wanted. But little things kept tugging at me. On the second day, I found boot prints near the edge of the clearing. Not mine. Too large, too deep. The ground was soft from recent rain, so they were fresh. I crouched there for a while, staring at them, feeling my stomach tighten. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe a hiker. That's what I told myself. But the direction of the prints wasn't random. They came out of the trees, stopped at the edge of the clearing, and turned back. Like someone had stood there for a while, looking toward the cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the thought. I lay awake, every muscle tight, straining to hear past the beating of my own heart. The stove crackled softly. The wind slid over the roof. But beneath it, every so often, I thought I caught something else. A shuffle, a pause, the faintest crunch on the ground outside. I told myself I was imagining it, but I still sat up in bed and stared out the window until dawn. By the third day, the cabin felt different. It wasn't rest anymore. It was work. I checked the doors constantly. I circled the clearing, looking for tracks. I thought about packing up, but pride kept me there. I didn't want to admit I'd been spooked out of the woods after barely 3 days. That afternoon, I walked farther along one of the narrow trails. It wound up through the pines and then dipped into a small ravine. At the bottom, near the creek, I found something that made my skin crawl. Ashes, still faintly black in a circle of stones. Someone had camped there recently. A tarp folded back in the brush. Empty cans half buried. Not old, not abandoned. Whoever it was had been there maybe a night or two before. I stood frozen, trying to measure the silence. The air was so still it hurt. No birds, no rustle, just me, standing in someone else's camp, in the shadow of my uncle's cabin. I turned back faster than I wanted to, every step too loud. By the time I reached the cabin clearing, I was sweating though the air was cool. I locked the door, lit the stove, and sat at the table staring at the wood grain until the light faded. That night I barely slept. The noises outside came again, slower this time, more deliberate. I thought I heard the porch steps creak once, just once, like weight had pressed down and lifted again. My breath stopped in my throat. I stared at the door, willing it not to move. Nothing happened. Eventually, light crept in through the cracks, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. By the fourth day, I knew I wasn't alone. I don't mean in the mystical sense. I mean someone else was out there, in the woods, moving close and then pulling back, watching. I started noticing little changes. A small stone placed on the porch that hadn't been there before. A branch snapped near the shed. The faint smell of smoke on the morning air when I hadn't lit anything yet. I kept telling myself to leave, drive out, call it quits. But something in me resisted. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe fear of what it meant to admit I was in danger. Maybe I thought if I waited it out, whoever it was would go away. On the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stacked a chair under the bedroom door handle and kept my uncle's old hunting knife on the nightstand. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might split me open. Hours passed in silence. Then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the unmistakable sound of fingers brushing the siding. Slow, sliding, testing. I wanted to shout, but the words froze in me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The touch lasted only a few seconds. Then it stopped. But I knew, without any doubt, someone had stood right outside the wall, inches from where I lay, dragging their hand across the boards. At dawn, I snapped. I packed everything into the duffel, shoved it in the car, and turned the key. The road was rough, and I drove too fast, bouncing and jolting, glancing in the mirror like I expected someone to follow. I didn't stop until I reached the first small town miles down the highway. I pulled into a gas station, sat there gripping the wheel, shaking so badly I couldn't fill the tank at first. The clerk asked if I was okay. I just nodded and left. I never went back. My uncle asked later how the trip had been. I told him the cabin was falling apart, that it wasn't worth fixing up. I never mentioned the prints, the camp, the sounds, but I think about it often. What kept me awake isn't what I saw, it's what I didn't. The careful distance, the patience, the way someone stayed just far enough to let me know they were there, but never close enough to reveal themselves. That kind of restraint isn't random. It isn't casual. Whoever it was knew what they were doing. They wanted me to feel them without ever seeing them. That's worse than anything else, because it means they're still out there, and maybe they're waiting for the next person who unlocks that door, thinking they've found a quiet place to rest. I was 32 when I decided to take a week off from work and spend it alone in a small rented cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. It was late September 2017. The trees had already started changing colors, and I liked the idea of being away from people for a while. My life in Detroit had become a constant loop of noise, traffic, and stress. The cabin was advertised online as quiet, secluded, perfect for hunting or writing. I wasn't a hunter, but I liked the thought of peace and silence. The drive took me almost 5 hours. The last stretch of road was a single-lane dirt path that seemed like it hadn't been graded in years. Pine needles covered the edges, and potholes forced me to slow to a crawl. My car jolted and rattled over every dip. I didn't see another car once I turned off the main road. It was almost like the woods swallowed me the farther I went in. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than the pictures had suggested. It sat in a small clearing with the tree line pushing right up behind it. The roof was metal, streaked brown from rust and rain. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and one of the steps looked uneven. A woodpile was stacked on the left, though many of the logs were damp and gray. Inside, it was basic but functional. One room with a bed, a small table, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, and a fireplace that looked like it had been used often. A single bathroom with a shower stall was tucked into the corner. The windows were thin, old glass panes that rattled slightly when the wind picked up. There was no cell service. I had expected that. The listing had warned about it. They said there was a landline phone in case of emergency, mounted on the wall near the door. I picked it up out of curiosity and heard the faint buzz of a live line. That gave me some comfort. The first evening was calm. I unpacked, lit a fire with some of the drier wood, and ate a simple meal I had brought with me. I spent an hour outside, watching the sky grow darker through the branches. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine. When night fell, it was darker than I had expected. No streetlights, no nearby houses, nothing but blackness around the clearing. The only sound was the crackle of my fire and the faint rush of wind in the trees. That first night, I slept deeply. The second day, I went for a walk through the woods. The paths were narrow and overgrown, but I followed deer tracks for a while, just wandering without a clear direction. I saw squirrels, a hawk, and once, far off, the white flash of a deer's tail as it bounded away. The silence of the woods pressed down on me. At home, even in the quietest times, there was always the hum of cars in the distance, or the low drone of the city. Out here, when the wind stopped, there was nothing. When I returned in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. On the porch, near the door, was a muddy footprint. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, wider than my boots, and the sole had a deep zigzag pattern. My boots had a flatter sole with straight ridges. I froze, standing a few feet from the porch, staring at it, pointed toward the door, not away. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was an old print from the owner, left before I arrived. But the edges of the mud looked fresh, still wet. The dirt around the clearing wasn't even that muddy. I checked the lock on the door. It was still secure, the deadbolt in place. Inside, everything looked untouched. My bag was where I left it, my food still in its cooler. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just leftover from before. Maybe I hadn't noticed when I first got here. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up and listen. The fire had burned low, and the shadows from the dying flames stretched across the ceiling like shifting branches. I stayed awake long past midnight, straining to hear anything outside. Eventually, exhaustion won and I drifted off. The third day, I stuck close to the cabin. I told myself I wanted to relax, but the truth was I didn't like the thought of wandering far away. I read a book for a while, wrote a few notes in a journal, and went outside to chop some of the damp logs to see if any were dry inside. The sky was overcast, and the air felt heavier, like rain was coming. In the late afternoon, while sitting at the small table inside, I glanced out the window. Between the trees at the far edge of the clearing, I thought I saw movement. A quick flicker of dark against the gray trunks. My heart jumped, and I stared for a long time. Nothing moved again. Maybe it had been a deer, maybe even just my eyes. That night, the sounds began. I was lying in bed, the fire nearly out, when I heard what sounded like a branch snapping outside. Not close, but not far either. Then, a few minutes later, another crack, closer this time. My skin prickled, and I held my breath, listening. The wind was low, barely moving the trees, so it didn't feel like branches falling naturally. I got up quietly and went to the window. The glass was cold against my forehead as I peered out. All I saw was blackness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the trees at the edge of the clearing looked like a solid wall of shadow. For almost an hour, I lay awake, listening. Every so often, there was a faint rustle or a crunch like a footstep on leaves. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I never saw anything, but the sounds continued until after 2 in the morning. The fourth day, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe there were animals around, deer, raccoons, even a bear. I tried to ignore the unease that sat heavy in my stomach. I busied myself with chores. I fetched water from the pump near the cabin, chopped more wood, swept the porch. But when I came back from carrying an armload of logs, I froze at the sight of the door. The deadbolt was unlocked. I was sure, absolutely sure, I had locked it behind me when I went out. I dropped the wood with a crash and rushed inside. Nothing seemed out of place at first. My bag was still zipped, my food untouched. But the landline phone was off the hook, dangling slightly from its cord. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisted cold. Someone had been inside. That night was worse than the others. I hardly slept at all. I sat up by the fire, a knife from the kitchen clenched in my hand. Every small sound outside made my throat tighten. Twice I thought I saw movement at the window, just a flicker of shadow against shadow. But when I turned my head quickly, nothing was there. The fifth day, I decided I had had enough. I packed my bag and loaded the car. The dirt road out was rough, but I drove fast, eager to be gone. But less than a mile out, my car jolted violently, and I heard the grinding scrape of metal. I pulled over, heart pounding. The front right tire was shredded. Not just flat, shredded, with deep cuts through the rubber like it had been slashed with something sharp. I had a spare, but as I opened the trunk, I found it flat as well. Not just low, but completely deflated, useless. I stood there in the silent woods, realizing what that meant. Someone had done this. I locked myself back inside the cabin. For the rest of the day, I didn't leave. I sat with the curtains pulled, heart pounding at every noise. That night, the noises came back, closer than before. Slow, deliberate crunches in the leaves, circling the cabin. Sometimes they stopped for long minutes, and I sat in silence, hardly breathing, before they started again on the other side. At one point, the doorknob rattled softly, just a small shake like someone testing it. The fire was dead, and the room was dark. I sat frozen in the bed, knife still in my grip, staring at the door until my eyes burned. The sixth day, I tried the landline phone. I dialed 911, but the line was dead. Nothing but silence on the other end. By then, I knew I was trapped. Whoever was out there didn't want me leaving. They had cut me off. That night was the longest of my life. Around midnight, the sounds outside grew bolder. Footsteps on the porch, a scrape against the wall. Then, sharp and clear, the sound of nails or maybe a knife, dragging slowly across the wood of the door. I stayed awake until dawn, my body shaking from exhaustion and fear. On the 7th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed only the essentials into a backpack, water, a flashlight, the knife, and left the cabin on foot. I didn't know if the road would help me. Maybe it would just lead me back into trouble. So I cut through the trees, heading south, where I knew the main road had to be miles away. The woods were thick, and the ground was uneven. Branches whipped my face, and my legs ached, but I kept going. I listened constantly, afraid of hearing footsteps behind me. Once I thought I did, soft crunches matching mine, just far enough back. But when I stopped, everything went silent. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and I kept walking. Finally, as the light was starting to fade, I heard the faint hum of cars. My chest nearly broke from relief. I pushed the cabin in the valley. I was 29 years old the first time I went out there, though it feels like a lifetime ago now. It was the summer of 1996. I had been working in a city that never seemed to rest, a place where car horns echoed day and night, and the sound of people's footsteps was a constant backdrop. I had grown sick of it. My head felt heavy, my chest tight, and I wanted silence more than anything else. When a coworker mentioned that his uncle owned a cabin tucked into a valley out in Montana, far from the nearest town, I latched onto the idea. The thought of days without people, without constant noise, sounded like medicine. I didn't think about the downsides. I just heard silence and imagined fresh air filling my lungs instead of exhaust fumes. The drive out was long. I left my small apartment in Portland before the sun came up. My car packed with a cooler of food, a couple of changes of clothes, and a flashlight I hadn't used in years. The interstate stretched endlessly, and the farther I went, the fewer cars I saw. By the second day of driving, I was surrounded by nothing but grasslands and rolling hills, occasional barns standing weathered and gray in the middle of empty fields. The air smelled different out there, like dry soil and pine. When I finally found the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The directions had been clear enough. 10 miles past the last gas station, then a right turn onto a road that didn't look like it belonged to anyone. The gravel crunched under my tires as the road wound down into a small valley, thick with trees on either side. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had already begun its slow drop toward the horizon. The cabin wasn't much, one story, a simple slant roof, logs darkened from years of weather. The windows were dusty, and the porch sagged a little on one end. But it was quiet, and that's all I had wanted. The first evening was uneventful. I carried my cooler and bag inside, set them on a rough wooden table, and walked through the place. It had one main room with a small stone fireplace, a narrow kitchen with an old gas stove, and a bedroom with a single bed covered in a thin quilt. The bathroom was outside, an outhouse a short walk into the trees. I remember thinking how old-fashioned it felt, but I didn't mind. It was all part of the escape. That first night, I sat on the porch as the light drained away and listened to the sounds I wasn't used to hearing. The rustling of leaves, the cry of some bird I couldn't name, the faint rush of wind moving through the trees on the ridge. It was a living silence, not the dead quiet of a sealed apartment. When darkness fell, it was total, a kind of black that made my eyes strain. I had a small lantern, but I turned it off just to see what the world felt like without any light. It was heavy, suffocating almost. I lay in bed that night and listened to every creak of the wood and shift of the wind, too alert to fall asleep quickly. The next day, I settled in. I explored the valley, walked up the ridge, and looked down at the cabin from above. The land stretched out far, no other cabins or houses in sight. I felt small out there, like I was tucked into a pocket the world had forgotten. It was peaceful, During the day, I chopped some wood for the fireplace and cooked simple meals on the stove. At night, I read by lantern light until my eyes grew heavy. For the first couple of days, it was exactly what I had wanted. But then the nights began to change. It started on the fourth night. I woke up suddenly, my body tense before my mind even knew why. The room was dark, but I had the sharp sense that something had made a sound. I lay still, my ears straining. At first, there was nothing but the usual hum of crickets and the distant rush of the wind through the trees. Then, faintly, I heard it. A crack, sharp like a branch snapping under weight. It had come from outside, near the trees at the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was a deer. There were plenty of deer in Montana. Still, I stayed awake for hours listening. Every small sound carried a weight in the darkness. When I finally slept, my dreams were restless. The following morning, I walked to the spot where I thought I had heard the sound. The ground was uneven, patches of grass mixed with bare dirt. I didn't see anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, just empty woods. I told myself I had imagined it, or if not, then it was some animal passing through. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I heard it closer. Another crack, then a faint rustle, like someone brushing past bushes. My skin prickled, and I held my breath in bed. I wanted to get up and look out the window, but fear pinned me to the mattress. I stared at the ceiling, my ears straining. The noises stopped after a while, and I lay there until the first gray light of dawn seeped in through the window. That morning, I checked again. This time, I thought I saw something in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. The soil had been pressed down in a way that didn't look natural. It was shaped almost like a footprint, though the edges were blurred and it could have been nothing more than erosion. Still, I felt my stomach sink. I told myself again it was an animal. Maybe a bear, maybe even a moose. I knew so little about the wildlife out there that it was easy to convince myself. The days passed slowly. I tried to focus on the peace, on the tasks I set myself. I read, I cooked, I went on hikes. But as the sun lowered each evening, I felt a tension grow in my chest. Nights had become something to endure. Every sound felt louder in the dark, sharper, more deliberate. On the sixth night, I swore I heard footsteps. Not the random snapping of a twig or the scurry of some small animal, but the slow, steady press of weight moving across ground. Step, pause. Step, pause. It circled the cabin, not close, but not far. I froze in bed, my ears pounding with my heartbeat. I didn't move until morning. The next day, I found more marks in the dirt. This time, I couldn't tell myself it was an animal. These were footprints, human footprints. They weren't large, but they were clear. I stared at them for a long time, my mind refusing to settle on what to think. Who would be out here? The nearest town was 30 miles away, and the gravel road that led here was barely visible from the highway. My coworker had told me no one else came out here, not even the uncle who owned the place. It didn't make sense. I wanted to leave, but I kept talking myself out of it. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe it was someone passing through. People wandered, didn't they? Still, the thought of packing up and driving away tugged at me. I ignored it. I told myself I was overreacting, but I wasn't. On the eighth night, the noises grew louder. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling again, when I heard it, the sound of someone stepping onto the porch. The boards groaned under weight. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps moved slowly across the porch, each one deliberate. Then silence. Whoever or whatever it was stood just outside the door. I could hear the faint creak of the wood under shifting weight. My hands shook. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, the boards creaked again, this time moving away. The steps faded until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. When dawn came, I opened the door slowly, my eyes scanning the porch. There, in the dust and dirt, were footprints, clear as day. A person had stood outside my cabin. My stomach twisted. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there. That day, I packed my bag. I stuffed my clothes into it, closed the cooler, and loaded everything back into the car. I told myself I was leaving, but when I sat behind the wheel, my hands gripping it tight, I froze. The idea of driving up that long gravel road and through miles of empty country suddenly felt worse. What if I ran into whoever it was? What if they were waiting? My chest tightened. I turned off the car and went back inside, telling myself I'd leave in the morning. But that night, they came back. I had locked the door, latched the windows, even wedged a chair under the handle. Still, I lay in bed, awake, waiting. The noises came later than before, maybe around 2 in the morning. First, the soft crunch of footsteps outside, circling. Then the porch again. The boards groaned. My chest seized with panic. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then I heard it, the rattle of the door handle. Slow at first, then harder, shaking against the chair I had wedged under it. The wood creaked, but it held. My heart felt like it was going to burst. Whoever it was didn't force their way in. After a long minute, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away again. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sky lightened, I grabbed my bag and left. This time, I didn't hesitate. I shoved everything into the car, started it, and drove. My hands shook on the wheel as the gravel road stretched out in front of me. Every bend made me flinch, expecting to see someone standing there. But the road was empty. I didn't I was 32 the year I decided to spend a week alone in the mountains of northern Montana. It was the fall of 2016, early October, when the air was sharp enough to bite, but the ground hadn't yet given itself fully to winter. I had been working long hours in construction, mostly commercial work, and I wanted a week away from people, machines, phones, and the constant ringing of tools. A family friend had a hunting cabin deep in the woods, not far from the Canadian border, and he agreed to let me use it. He warned me about the remoteness, that it wasn't a place for anyone who wasn't comfortable with silence, darkness, or the possibility of running into something wild. That, of course, was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took nearly 8 hours. The last hour was spent on a dirt road full of deep ruts, steep inclines, and switchbacks. My old truck barely held together as it crawled over rocks and gravel, the tires throwing up dust that clung to the windshield in a fine brown film. The road narrowed until the branches of pines scraped both sides of the truck like claws. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin sat waiting at the edge of a thick line of timber, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of years but otherwise solid. It was a small place. One room, a loft, a wood stove in the corner with a metal chimney that bent crookedly toward the sky. The wood siding was weathered to a grayish silver. 2 steps led up to a porch that was barely wide enough for a chair. The clearing around it was about half the size of a football field, ringed in all directions by pine, spruce, and fir trees so dense they seemed to swallow the daylight. I unpacked slowly, carrying in canned food, a few gallons of water, my sleeping bag, an axe, a flashlight, and a rifle I had brought along more for comfort than necessity. The cabin smelled of dry wood and old ash. Dust floated lazily in the light that pushed through the single window on the south wall. The air inside was cool and still. By late afternoon, I had settled in. I split a pile of wood and stacked it under a tarp near the cabin wall. I swept out mouse droppings with a stiff broom I found leaning against the doorframe. I got the stove going, the fire taking quickly to the dry cedar kindling. The sound of crackling would fill the cabin, and the heat spread across the small space in waves. That night, I lay on the cot in the loft, listening. At first, all I could hear was the low whistle of wind through the cracks in the logs and the occasional popping of the fire below me. But the longer I stayed awake, the more my ears tuned themselves to the subtler sounds outside. Branches snapping far off in the woods, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant yip of a coyote. It wasn't threatening, just alive. The forest had its own rhythm, and I was just another piece in it. The next morning, fog hung low in the trees. The ground was wet with dew. The grass around the cabin bent under the weight of moisture. I spent the day exploring the area, following a game trail that wound up the ridge to the north. I found deer tracks in the mud, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. I also saw what I thought were bear prints, larger and more sunken, though they could have been from weeks earlier. The silence of the woods was heavier the deeper I went. I carried the rifle slung across my back, not expecting to use it, but every now and then I felt my grip tighten around the strap. I had the sense of being watched, though I knew it was probably just the newness of isolation playing tricks on me. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was sliding down and the cold was already creeping back in. That night, the woods felt different. I woke sometime after midnight to a sound outside. It wasn't the soft cracking of branches or the distant cry of an animal. It was deliberate, slow, crunching footsteps moving across the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe elk, wandering near the cabin, but the sound was heavy, too evenly paced. I lay still in the loft, staring into the dark, every muscle locked tight. The steps stopped just outside. For what felt like a full minute, there was nothing but silence. Then a scraping noise, like something being dragged lightly along the porch boards. My mouth went dry. I reached for the rifle propped against the wall, my fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. The sound faded eventually. The footsteps retreated across the clearing, swallowed by the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I told myself it had been an animal, maybe a moose or a black bear nosing around. I forced myself to believe that as I stepped outside to look. The grass was damp and pressed down in several places near the porch, but I couldn't find any clear tracks. The ground wasn't soft enough to hold a print. The day passed quietly, though I found myself constantly glancing toward the trees, watching for movement. I tried to distract myself by chopping more wood, by walking to a nearby stream to refill my water jugs, but the feeling of unease clung to me like a shadow. That night, the sound came back. This time, it was closer. I had just started to drift when a sharp thud jolted me awake. My heart slammed in my chest as I listened. Something was moving around the cabin, circling. The crunch of footsteps in the dirt moved from one side to the other, pausing now and then. I sat upright, gripping the rifle. My breath came shallow, ragged, the silence between each step louder than the step itself. At one point, the sound rose onto the porch. The boards creaked under the weight of something heavy. I aimed the rifle toward the door, though I could barely see in the dark. My finger rested on the trigger, tight but not pulling. The doorknob rattled, just once, a faint metallic shake like someone testing it. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds, before the sound faded again, retreating into the night. I stayed awake until dawn, the rifle never leaving my hands. When morning came, I checked the porch. The knob showed faint smudges, not clear enough to say what they were. The boards, though, held the outline of mud pressed by boots. Not animal tracks, boots. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there. The rest of that day was a blur of nervous movements. I checked the cabin, the window, the back wall, even though I knew whoever it was hadn't tried to force their way in. I told myself maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone lost, but the way they had circled, the way they had tested the knob, made it clear they weren't just passing by. I considered leaving, but the road was rough and long, and part of me thought I might just be overreacting. I had food, water, a weapon, and a solid cabin. I could wait it out, but the third night proved me wrong. Started the same footsteps, slow and careful. Then a scratching sound at the window, like fingernails on glass. I lay in the loft, muscles locked, staring at the faint square of moonlight on the wall. My mind raced through possibilities. One person, maybe more, waiting just outside. Hours seemed to pass before the noises stopped. The next day, I made up my mind. I packed everything, loaded it back into the truck, and decided to leave before sunset. The whole time, I felt eyes on me from the tree lean. My hands shook as I tied down the tarp over my gear. When I finally started the truck, the sound of the engine was so loud it felt unnatural, almost wrong against the silence of the clearing. I backed out, gravel crunching under the tires, and aimed for the road down the ridge. Half a mile in, I saw it. On the side of the road, pressed into the mud, were fresh boot prints. More than one set. They led out from the woods, across the road, and back in again. Someone had been following me, watching. I didn't stop to look closer. I pressed the gas, the truck rattling and bouncing down the dirt road, my eyes flicking to the mirror again and again, half expecting to see a figure step out into the road behind me. It took hours, but eventually the forest thinned, the road widened, and I saw the first sign of another house in the distance. My chest loosened only then. When I finally reached pavement, I pulled over, resting my forehead against the steering wheel, my body shaking from the weight of it all. I never told anyone the full story. I said I cut the trip short because of the weather. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know there are people out there who move through those woods, silent and patient, watching. I'll never go back to that cabin again. I never really planned on spending that much time alone in the woods. I wasn't the kind of person who lived for hunting trips or hiking trails or whatever else people romanticize about being off the grid. I was 26 at the time, living in a noisy apartment in the city, surrounded by traffic and endless noise, and the only reason I ended up with that cabin in the mountains was because a friend of mine said it would do me good to get away for a while. It was October of 2018 when I first drove up there. The cabin was about 4.5 hours from where I lived in Portland, Oregon, tucked into a stretch of forest land just outside a town called Oak Ridge. My friend Ben knew the owner of the place, an older guy who mostly used it in the summers, and he offered it to me for a week. I didn't ask many questions. The idea of quiet, no emails, no late-night street racing sounds outside my window, no neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, that all sounded like a luxury. The drive out wasn't bad. Long stretches of highway gave way to winding two-lane roads that hugged the mountains. The higher I went, the thinner the air seemed to feel, the more the trees gathered close, blocking out the sun. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the woods had that shadowed look that always made me think of the last few minutes before night hits. The cabin itself wasn't anything impressive. A one-story rectangle with dark, weather-beaten siding, a steep roof, and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly in one corner. A stone chimney poked out of the roof. The yard wasn't really a yard at all, just a rough clearing hacked out of the trees, with fallen pine needles and damp earth. My car crunched over the gravel as I parked, and I just sat there for a while with the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the place. It looked isolated. No houses nearby, no power lines visible, no sign of life other than the structure itself. For a second, I wondered if maybe this was a mistake. I wasn't used to silence. My life had been a constant background hum of engines, voices, and screens for years. Now, all I could hear was the creak of the cooling engine and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Inside, the cabin was plain. Wooden floors scuffed by boots, a narrow kitchen with outdated appliances, a fireplace stacked with wood beside it, a single bedroom with a sagging bed, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. There was no TV, no internet router, no cell service once I checked my phone. The only light came from a couple of bare bulbs powered by a loud little gas generator out back. The first night passed quietly. I cooked pasta on the stove, listened to the wind scrape against the windows, and wrote in a notebook since I had nothing else to do. I remember the darkness outside being so complete that when I turned off the inside lights, it felt like the walls were closing in. I had never experienced darkness that deep, where even the outlines of trees disappeared. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time the old wood popped or the wind shifted, my eyes snapped open. The next day, I tried to make myself comfortable. I chopped some wood with the rusted axe I found in the shed. I took a short walk down a path that looked like it led to a creek. The forest was dense. Thick pines and firs, trunks crowded close, with moss hanging heavy from the branches. Every sound carried strangely. A squirrel scurrying across the leaves sounded almost like footsteps. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the lack of familiar city noise making me jumpy. By the third day, I had fallen into a strange rhythm. Wake up late, cook something simple, read from the stack of old paperbacks I found in the cabin, and take short walks in the woods. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed little things that put me on edge. One morning, I found fresh boot prints in the dirt near the tree line behind the cabin. They weren't mine. They were larger than my feet and deeper, like someone heavier had walked through recently. At first, I thought maybe the owner or a neighbor had come by, but the closest house was miles away, and I hadn't heard an engine or seen another car. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside. Not the usual creaks or gusts of wind, but something moving slowly through the brush. Heavy enough to snap twigs, but steady, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears. The sound circled the cabin, crunching softly, pausing every so often. I couldn't see anything through the windows, it was too dark, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever it was would hear it. Eventually, the steps faded and the silence returned, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found nothing unusual outside except for what looked like another faint boot print near the porch steps. I told myself it could have been there before and I just hadn't noticed. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the 5th day, my nerves were frayed. I barely left the cabin. Every little sound outside made me tense. The woods felt hostile, like they were pressing in on me. I started keeping the axe inside with me, leaning it against the wall near the door. I hated how paranoid I felt, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore it. That night, just after midnight, I woke up to a faint sound, metal tapping against glass. I froze in bed, my skin cold, listening hard. The sound came again, sharper this time. It was the window in the main room. Someone was out there, tapping on the glass. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, I slid out of bed, gripping the axe so hard my hands hurt. I crept to the doorway of the main room and stood in the dark. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. I didn't dare switch on the light. I just stood there, staring at the black outline of the window, waiting. And then I saw it. Not clearly, just a faint outline. A shape standing inches from the glass. Too tall, too still. My throat went dry. I stood frozen in the dark, axe raised, while whoever it was stood just outside the window. I don't know how long we stayed like that, seconds, minutes, it blurred together. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted, and the figure moved away into the night. I didn't sleep at all. When the weak daylight finally came, I went outside and looked. On the glass of the window were faint smudges, like oily handprints. On the ground below, more boot prints, circling the cabin. I wanted to leave right then, but the thought of driving down those narrow roads in the dark, through miles of forest, with whoever that was still out there, kept me frozen. I told myself I'd wait until morning. That evening, as the sun dropped, I packed my bag. I couldn't stand another night there. But just as I was getting ready to haul my stuff to the car, the generator sputtered and died. The lights went out. The sudden silence was crushing. I stepped outside to check it, clutching the axe, my breath clouding in the cold air. The generator sat behind the cabin. The gas can tipped over beside it, empty. I knew for a fact it had been half full that morning. Someone had drained it. Panic hit me hard then. My only source of power was gone, and someone had been close enough to sabotage it without me hearing. I ran back inside, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the knob. The night closed in fast, thick and suffocating. Hours crawled by. I sat in the dark with the axe, listening. At one point, there was a scraping sound at the back door, like metal on wood. I held my breath, waiting for the door to shutter, but it never did. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin again. Sometimes they stopped right under the window, like whoever it was leaning close, listening for me. I don't know how long it lasted. Time lost all meaning in that black silence. But sometime after 3 in the morning, there was a sharp crack, a gunshot echoing through the trees. Not at the cabin, but somewhere nearby. After that, the footsteps stopped. I didn't move until the sky lightened with dawn. When it did, I bolted. I grabbed my bag, sprinted to the car, and peeled out of there so fast the gravel spit behind me. My hands shook so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, the forest shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. I never went back. I never asked about the cabin again. Never told Ben or the owner what happened. Part of me didn't want to know. But sometimes, even now, I think about those prints on the window, the drain generator, the footsteps circling in the night. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. And if that gunshot hadn't gone off when it did, I'm not sure I'd be here to write this.